John Norton, Chapter 7 of Celibates, by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. But if in the morning he was strong, Kitty was more beautiful than ever. They walked towards the tennis seat with its red-striped awning. They listened to the feeble cawing of young rooks swinging on the branches. They watched the larks nestle in and fly out of the golden meadow. It was Maytime, and the air was bright with buds and summer bees. She was dressed in white, and the shadow of the straw hat fell across her eyes when she raised her face. He was dressed in black, and the clerical frock coat, buttoned by one button at the throat, fell straight. They sat under the red-striped awning of the tennis seat. The large grasping hands holding the polished cane contrasted with the reedy, translucent hands laid upon the white folds. The low, sweet breath of the Maytime breathed within them, and their hearts were light. Hers was only conscious of the Maytime, but his was awake with unconscious love, and he yielded to her, to the perfume of the garden, to the absorbing sweetness of the moment. He was no longer John Norton. His being was part of the Maytime. It had gone forth and had mingled with the colour of the fields and sky, with the life of the flowers, with all vague scents and sounds. "How beautiful the day is," he said, speaking slowly. "Is it not all light and colour? And you in your white dress, with the sunlight on your hair, seem more blossom-like than any flower. I wonder what flower I should compare you to. Shall I say a rose? No, not a rose, nor a lily, nor a violet. You remind me rather of a tall, delicate, pale carnation." "Why, John, I never heard you speak like that before. I thought you never paid compliments." The transparent green of the limes shivered, the young rooks cawed feebly, and the birds flew out of and nestled with amorous wings in the golden meadow. Kitty had taken off her straw hat. The sunlight caressed the delicate plenitudes of the bent neck, the delicate plenitudes bound with white cambric swelling gently over the bosom into the narrow of the waist, cambric fluting to the little wrist, reedy translucid hands, cambric falling outwards and flowing like a great white flower over the greensward, over the mauve stocking and the little shoe set firmly. The ear like a rose leaf, a fluff of light hair trembling on the curving nape, and the head crowned with thick brown gold. And her pale marmoreal eyes were haunted by a yearning look which he had always loved, and which he had hitherto only found in some beautiful relics of antiquity. She seemed to him purged as a Greek statue of all life's grossness, and as the women of Botticelli and Mantegna she seemed to him to live in a long afternoon of unchanging aspiration. And it seemed to him that he thought of her as impersonally as he thought of these women, and the fact that she participated in the life of the flesh neither concerned him nor did it matter. That she lived in the flesh instead of in marble was an accident. He smiled at the paradox, for he had recovered from the fears of overnight, and was certain that even the longing to strain her in his arms was only part of the impulse which compels our lips to the rose, which buries our hands in the earth when we lie at length, which fills our souls with longing for white peaks and valleys when the great clouds tower and shine. And that evening as he sat in his study his thoughts suddenly said, "She is the symbol of my inner life." Surprised and perplexed, he sought the meaning of the words. He was forced to admit that her beauty had penetrated his soul. But was it not natural for him to admire all beautiful things, especially things on a certain plane of idea? He had admired other women. In what then did his admiration for this woman differ from that which others had drawn from him? In his admiration for other women there had always been a sense of repulsion. This feeling of repulsion seemed to be absent from his admiration for Kitty. He hardly perceived any sex in her. She was sexless as a work of art, as the women of the first Italian painters, as some Greek statues. Then by natural association of ideas his mind was carried back to early youth, to struggles with himself, and to temptations which he had conquered, and the memory of which he was always careful to keep out of mind. In that critical time he had felt that it was essential for him to come to terms with life. And the terms he had discovered were strictest adhesion to the rules laid down by the Catholic Church for the conduct of life. He had lived within these rules and had received peace. Now, for the first time, that peace was seriously assailed. His thoughts continued their questioning, and he found himself asking if sufficient change had come into his nature to allow him to accept marriage. But before answer could be given, an opposing thought asked if this girl were more than a mere emissary of Satan. And with that thought all that was mediaeval in him arose. Femina dulce mahim pariter favus atque venenum. Not sweet evil, he said, determined to outdo the monk in denunciation, but the vilest of evils, not honeycomb and venom, but filth and venom. Though as fair as roses, the beginning, the end, is gall and wormwood. Heartache and misery are the end of love. Why then do we seek passion when we may find happiness only in calm? He had known the truth as if by instinct from the first. No life was possible for him except an ascetic life, but he had no vocation for the priesthood. True that in a moment of weakness, after a severe illness, he had returned to Stanton College with the intention of taking orders, but with renewal of health the truth had come home to him that he was as unfitted to the priesthood as he was for marriage, or nearly so. The path of his life lay between the church and the world. He must remain in the world, though he never could be of the world. He could only view the world as a spectator. As a passing pageant it interested him, and with art and literature and music for necessary distraction, and the fixed resolve to save his soul, nothing really mattered but that he hoped to achieve his destiny. End of John Norton, Chapter 7, recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 8 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. We play billiards here on Sunday, but you would think it wrong to do so. But today is not Sunday. No, I was only speaking in a general way. Yet I often wonder how you can feel satisfied with the protection your church affords you against the miseries and trials of the world. A Protestant may believe pretty nearly as little or as much as he likes, whereas in our church everything is defined. We know what we must believe to be saved. There is a sense of security in the Catholic Church which the Protestant has not. Do you think so? That is because you do not know our church, replied Kitty, who was a little astonished at this sudden outburst. I feel quite happy and safe. I know that our Lord Jesus Christ died on the cross to save us, and we have the Bible to guide us. Yes, but the Bible without the interpretation of the church may lead to error. For instance, John stopped abruptly. Seized with a sudden scruple of conscience, he asked himself if he in his own house had a right to strive to undermine the faith of the daughter of his own friend. "Go on," cried Kitty, laughing. "I know the Bible better than you, and if I break down I will ask father." And as if to emphasize her intention, she hit her ball, which was close under the cushion, as hard as she could. John hailed the rent in the cloth as a deliverance, for in the discussion as to how it could be repaired, the religious question was forgotten. And this idyll was lived about the beautiful Italian house, with its urns and pilasters, through the beautiful English park with its elms now with the splendor of summer upon them, in the pleasure grounds with their rosery, and the fountain where the rose leaves float, and the wood pigeons come at eventide to drink, in the greenhouse with its live glare of geraniums, where the great yellow cat, so soft and beautiful, springs on Kitty's shoulder, rounds its back, and purring insists on caresses, in the large clean stables where the horses munch the corn lazily and look round with round inquiring eyes, and the rooks croak and flutter and strut about Kitty's feet. One morning he said as they went into the garden, "You must sometimes feel a little lonely here, when I am away, all alone here with mother." "Oh dear no, we have lots to do. I look after the pets in the morning, I feed the cats and the rooks, and I see that the canaries have fresh water and seed. And then the bees take up a lot of our time. We have 22 hives. Mrs. Norton says she ought to make £5 a year on each. Sometimes we lose a swarm or two, and then Mrs. Norton is cross. We were out for hours with the gardener the other day, but we could do no good. We could not get them out of that elm tree. You see that long branch leaning right over the wall? Well, it was on that branch that they settled, and no ladder was tall enough to reach them. And when Bill climbed to the tree and shook them out, they flew right away. And in the afternoon we go out for drives. We pay visits. You never pay visits. You never go and call on your neighbors." "Oh, yes, I do. I went the other day to see your father." "Ah, yes, but that is only because he talks to you about Latin authors." "No, I assure you it isn't. Once I have finished my book I shall never look at them again." "Well, what will you do?" "I don't know. It depends on circumstances." "What circumstances?" said Kitty innocently. The words "whether you will or will not have me" rose to John's lips, but all power to speak them seemed to desert him. He had grown suddenly as weak as snow, and in an instant the occasion had passed. On another occasion they were walking in the park. "I never would have believed, John, that you would care to go out for a walk with me." "And why, Kitty?" Kitty laughed. Her short sudden laugh was strange and sweet, and John's heart was beating. "Well," she said, without the faintest hesitation or shyness, "we always thought you hated girls. I know I used to tease you when you came home for the first time, when you used to think of nothing but the Latin authors." "What do you mean?" Kitty laughed again. "You promise not to tell?" "I promise." This was their first confidence. "You told your mother when I came, when you were sitting by the fire reading, that the flutter of my skirts disturbed you." "No, Kitty, I'm sure you never disturbed me, or at least for a long time. I wish my mother would not repeat conversations. It is most unfair." "Mind, you promised not to repeat what I have told you. If you do, you will get me into an awful scrape." "I promise." The conversation came to a pause. Kitty looked up, and, overtaken by a sudden nervousness, John said, "We had better make haste. The storm is coming. We shall get wet through." And he made no further attempt to screw his courage up to the point of proposing, but asked himself if his powerlessness was a sign from God that he was abandoning his true vocation for a false one. He knew that he would not propose. If he did, he would break his engagement when it came to the point of marriage. He was as unfitted for marriage as he was for the priesthood. He had deceived himself about the priesthood as he was now deceiving himself about marriage. No, not deceiving himself, for at the bottom of his heart he could hear the truth. Then why did he continue this? It was no better than a comedy, an unworthy comedy, from which he did not seem to be able to disentangle himself. He could not say why. He could not understand himself. His brain was on fire, and he knelt down to pray. But when he prayed, the thoughts of bringing a soul home to the fold tempted him like a star, and he asked himself if Kitty had not in some of their conversations shown leanings toward Catholicism. If this were so, would it be right to desert her in a critical moment? End of John Norton, Chapter 8, recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 9 of Celibates, by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. He had not proposed when Mr. Hare wrote for his daughter, and Kitty returned to Henfield. John at first thought that this absence was the solution of his difficulty, but he could not forget her, and it became one of his pleasures to start early in the morning, and having spent a long day with her, to return home across the downs. "What a beautiful walk you will have, Mr. Norton. But you are not tired? 7 miles in the morning and 7 in the evening." "But I have had the whole day to rest in." "What a lovely evening! Let's all walk a little way with him," said Kitty. "I should like to," said the elder Miss Austen, "but we promised father to be home for dinner. The one sure way of getting into his black books is to keep his dinner waiting, and he wouldn't dine without us." "Well, good bye, dear," said Kitty. "I shall walk as far as the Burg." The Miss Austens turned into the trees that encircled Leywood. Kitty and John faced the hill, and ascending, they soon stood, tiny specks upon the evening hours. Speaking of the Devil's Dyke, Kitty said, "What, you mean to say you never heard the legend? You, a Sussex man!" "I have lived very little in Sussex, and I used to hate the place. I am only just beginning to like it, but tell me the legend." "Very well, let's try and find a place where we can sit down. The grass is full of that horrid prickly gorse." "Here's a nice soft place. There is no gorse here. Now tell me the legend." "You do astonish me," said Kitty, seating herself on the spot that had been chosen for her. "You never heard of the legend of St. Cuthman? Won't you cross the poor gypsy's palm with a bit of silver, my pretty gentleman, and she'll tell you your fortune and that of your pretty lady." Kitty uttered a startled cry, and turning they found themselves facing a strong, black-eyed girl. "What do you think, Kitty? Would you like to have your fortune told?" Kitty laughed. "It would be rather fun," she said. And she listened to the usual story of a handsome young gentleman who would woo her. John threw the girl a shilling. She withdrew. They watched her passing through the firs. "What nonsense they talk! You don't believe that there's anything in what they say," said Kitty, raising her eyes. John's eyes were fixed upon her. He tried to answer her question, which he had only half heard, but he could not form an intelligible sentence. There was a giddiness in his brain which he had never felt before. He trembled, and the victim of an impulse which forced him toward her, he threw his arms about her and kissed her violently. "Oh, don't!" cried the girl. "Let me go. Oh, John, how could you?" And disengaging herself from his arms, she looked at him. The expression of a deep sorrow and regret on his face surprised her more even than his kiss. She said, "What is the matter, John? Why did you—" She did not finish the sentence. "Do not ask me. I do not know. I cannot explain. A sudden impulse for which I am hardly accountable." "You are so beautiful," he said, taking her hand gently, "that the temptation to kiss you— I don't know. I suppose it is natural desire to kiss what is beautiful. But you'll forget this. You will never mention it. I humbly beg your pardon." John sat looking into space, and seeing how troubled he was, Kitty excused the kiss. "I'm sure I forgive you, John. There was no great harm. I believe young men often kiss girls. The Austen girls do, I know, they have told me so. I shouldn't have cried out so if you hadn't taken me by surprise. I forgive you, John. I know you didn't mean it. You meant nothing." His face frightened her. "You must never do so again. It is not right. But we have known each other always. I don't think it was a sin. I don't think that father or Mrs. Norton would think it. But they must never know. You promise me, Kitty. I am grateful to you what you have said in my excuse. I dare say the Austin girls do kiss young men, but because they do so it does not follow that it is right. No girl should kiss a man unless she intends to marry him." "But," said Kitty laughing, "if he kisses her by force, what is she to do?" For she failed to perceive that to snatch a kiss was as important as John seemed to think. But he told her that she must not laugh, that she must try to forgive him. "It is unpardonable," he said, "for I cannot marry you. We are not of the same religion." "But you don't want to marry me, John. To marry me just because you kissed me. People kiss every year under the mistletoe, but they don't marry each other." "It is as you like, Kitty." But forced on by his conscience, he said, "We might obtain a dispensation. You know nothing of our church. If you did, you might become a convert. I wish you would consider the question. It is so simple. We surrender our own wretched understanding and are content to accept the church as wiser than we. Once man throws off restraint, there is no happiness, there is only misery. One step leads to another. If he would be logical he must go on, and before long, for the descent is very rapid indeed, he finds himself in an abyss of darkness and doubt, a terrible abyss indeed, where nothing exists and life has lost all meaning. The Reformation was the thin end of the wedge. It was the first denial of authority, and you see what it has led to, modern scepticism and modern pessimism. I don't know what that means, but I heard Mrs. Norton say you were a pessimist." "I was. But I saw in time where it was leading me, and I crushed it out. I used to be a Republican too, but I saw what liberty meant and what were its results, and I gave it up." "So you gave up all your ideas for Catholicism." John hesitated. He seemed a little startled, but he answered, "I would give up anything for my church." "And did it cost you much to give up your ideas?" "Yes, I have suffered, but now I am happy, and my happiness would be complete if God would grant you grace to believe. But I do believe. I believe in our Lord Jesus, who died to save us. Is not that enough?" There was no wind on the down, and still as a reflection in a glass the grey barren land rolled through the twilight. Beyond it the circling sea and the girl's figure distinct on a golden hour. John watched a moment and then hastened homeward. He was overpowered by fear of the future. He trembled with anticipation and prayed that accident might lead him out of the difficulty into which a chance moment had betrayed him. End of John Norton, Chapter 9, recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 10 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. When she rose from the ground she saw a tall, gaunt figure passing away like a shadow. "What a horrible man! He attacked me, ill-treated me. What for?" Her thoughts turned aside. He should be put in prison. If father knew it, or John knew it, he would be put in prison, and for a very long time. Why did he attack me? Perhaps to rob me. Yes, to rob me, of course, to rob me. To rob her, and of what? Of her watch. Where was it? It was gone. The watch was gone. But had she lost it? Should she go back and see if she could find it? Oh, impossible. See the place again? Impossible. Search among the gorse? Impossible. Then, as her thoughts broke away, she thought of how she had escaped being murdered. How thankful she ought to be. But somehow she was not thankful. She was conscious of a horror of returning to where she would see men and women's faces. "I cannot go home," thought the girl. And acting in direct contradiction to her thoughts, she walked forward. Her parasol, where was it? It was broken. She brushed herself, she picked bits of furs from her dress. She held each away from her and let it drop in a silly, vacant way, all the while running the phrases over in her mind. "He threw me down and ill-treated me. My frock is ruined. What a state it is in. I had a narrow escape of being murdered." I will tell them that. That will explain. I had a narrow escape of being murdered. But presently she grew conscious that these thoughts were fictitious thoughts, and that there was a thought, a real thought, lying in the background of her mind, which she dared not face. And failing to do so, she walked on hurriedly. She almost ran, as if to force out of sight the thought that for a moment threatened to define itself. Suddenly she stopped. There were some children playing by the farm gate. They did not know that she was by, and she listened to their childish prattle. End of John Norton, Chapter 10, recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 11 of Celibates, by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. The front door was open. She heard her father calling, but she felt she could not see him. She must hide from his sight, and dashing upstairs she double-locked her door. The sky was still flushed, there was light upon the sea, but the room was dim and quiet. Her room. She had lived in many years, had seen it under all aspects. Then why did she look with strained eyes? Why did she shrink? Nothing has been changed. There is her little narrow bed, and her little bookcase full of novels and prayer books. There is her work basket by the fireplace closed in with curtains that she herself embroidered. Above her pillow there is a crucifix. There are photographs of the Miss Austins, and pictures of pretty children cut from the Christmas numbers on the walls. She started at the sight of these familiar objects, and trembled in the room which she had thought of as a haven of refuge. Why? She didn't know. Something that is at once remembrance and suspicion filled her mind, and she asked if this was her room. She sighed, and approaching her bedside raised her hands to her neck. It was the instinctive movement of undressing, but she did not unbutton her collar. Resuming her walk, she picked up a blossom that had fallen from the fuchsia. She walked to and fro. Then she threw herself on her bed and closed her eyes. She slept, and then the moonlight showed her face convulsed. She is the victim of a dream. Something follows her, she knows not what. She dare not look around. She falls over great leaves. She falls into the clefts of ruined tombs, and her hands, as she attempts to rise, are laid on sleeping snakes. They turn to attack her. They glide away and disappear in moss and inscriptions. Before her the trees extend in complex colonnades. Silent ruins are grown through with giant roots, and about the mysterious entrances of the crypts there lingers yet the odor of ancient sacrifices. The stem of a rare column rises amid the branches. The fragment of an arch hangs over and is supported by a dismantled tree trunk, and through the torrid twilight of the approaching storm the cry of the hyena is heard. The claws of the hyena are heard upon the crumbling tombs, and the suffocating girl strives with her last strength to free herself from the thrall of the great lianas. But there comes a hirsute smell. She turns with terrified eyes to plead, but meets only dull, liquorish eyes, and the breath of the obscene animal is hot on her face. She sprang from her bed. Was there anyone in her room? No, only the moonlight. But the forest, the wild animal, was it then only a dream? The girl thought. It was only a dream, a horrible dream, but after all only a dream. Then a voice within her said, but all was not a dream. There was something that was worse than the dream. She walked to and fro, and when she lay down her eyelids strove against sleep. But sleep came again, and her dream was of a brown and yellow serpent. She saw it from afar, rearing its tawny hide, scenting its prey. She takes refuge in the rosary. How will she save herself? By plucking roses and building a wall between her and it. So she collects huge bouquets, armfuls of beautiful flowers, garlands and wreaths. The flower wall rises, and hoping to combat the fury of the beast with purity, she goes whither snowy blossoms bloom in clustering millions. She gathers them in haste. Her arms and hands stream with blood, but she pays no heed, and as the snake surmounts one barricade she builds another. But the reptile leans over the roses, the long thin neck is upon her. She feels the horrid strength of the coils as they curl and slip about her, drawing her whole life into one knotted and loathsome embrace. Then she knows not how, but while the roses fall in a red and white rain about her, she escapes from the stench of the scaly hide, from the strength of the coils. And without any transition in place or time, she finds herself listening to the sound of rippling water. There is an iron drinking cup close to her hand. She seems to recognize the spot. It is Shoreham. There are the streets she knows so well, the masts of the vessels, the downs. But something darkens the sunlight. The tawny body of the snake oscillates. The people cry to her to escape. She flies along the streets. Like the wind she seems to pass. She calls for help. Sometimes the crowds are stationary, as if frozen into stone. Sometimes they follow the snake and attack it with sticks and knives. One man with colossal shoulders wields a great sabre. It flashes about him like lightning. Will he kill it? He turns, chases a dog, and disappears. The people too have disappeared. She is now flying along a wild plain, covered with coarse grass and wild poppies. The snake is near her, and there is no one to whom she can call for help. But the sea is in front of her. She will escape down the rocks. There is still a chance. The descent is sheer, but somehow she retains foothold. Then the snake drops. She feels its weight upon her, and with a shriek she awakes. The moon hung over the sea flowed with silver, the world was as chill as an icicle. The roses, the snake, the cliff's edge, was it then only a dream, the girl thought? It was only a dream, a terrible dream, but after all only a dream. Then a voice within her said, but all was not a dream. There was something that was worse than the dream. She uttered a low cry, she moaned. She drew herself up on her bed and lay with her face buried in the pillow. Again she fought against sleep, but sleep came again, and in overpowering dream she lay as if dead. And she sees herself dead. All her friends are about her, crowning her with flowers, beautiful garlands of white roses. They dress her in a long white robe, white as the snowiest cloud in heaven, and it lies in long straight plaits about her limbs, like the robes of those who lie in marble in cathedral aisles. It falls over her feet, her hands are crossed over her breast, and all praise in low but ardent words the excessive whiteness of the garment. For none but she sees that there is a black spot upon the robe which they believe to be immaculate. She would warn them of their error, but she cannot, and when they avert their eyes to wipe away their tears, the stain might be easily seen, but as they continue their last offices, folds or flowers fall over the stain and hide it from view. It is great pain to her to find herself unable to tell them of their error, for she well knows that when she is placed in the tomb and the angels come, they will not fail to perceive the stain, and seeing it, they will not fail to be shocked and sorrowful, and seeing it, they will turn away weeping, saying, "She is not for us, alas, she is not for us." And Kitty, who is conscious of this fatal oversight, the results of which she so clearly foresees, is grievously afflicted, and she makes every effort to warn her friends of their error. But there is one amid the mourners who knows that she is endeavouring to tell of the black stain, And this one, whose face she cannot readily distinguish, maliciously and with diabolical ingenuity withdraws the attention of the others so that they do not see it. And so it befell her to be buried in the stained robe, and she is taken away amid flowers and white cloths to a white tomb, where incense is burning, and where the walls are hung with votive wreaths and things commemorative of virginal life. But upon all these, upon the flowers and images alike, there is some small stain which none sees but she, and the one in shadow, the one whose face she cannot recognize. And although she is nailed fast in her coffin, she sees these stains vividly, and the one whose face she cannot recognize sees them too. And this is certain, for the shadow of the face is stirred by laughter. The mourners go, the evening darkens, the wild sunset floats for a while through the western heavens. The cemetery becomes a deep green, and in the wind that blows out of heaven the cypresses rock like things sad and mute. Then the blue night comes with stars in her tresses, and out of those stars angels float softly, their white feet hanging out of blown folds, their wings pointing to the stars. And from out of the earth, out of the mist, but whence and how it is impossible to say, there come other angels, dark of hue and foul smelling. But the white angels carry swords, and they wave these swords, and the scene is reflected in them as in a mirror. The dark angels cower in a corner of the cemetery, but they do not utterly retire. The tomb mysteriously opens, and the white angels enter the tomb. And the coffin is opened, and the girl trembles lest the angels should discover the stain she knew of. But lo, to her great joy they do not see it, and they bear her away through the blue night, through the stars of heaven. And it is not until one whose face she cannot recognize, and whose presence among the angels of heaven she cannot comprehend, steals away one of the garlands with which she is entwined, that the fatal stain becomes visible. Then, relinquishing their burden, the angels break into song, and the song they sing is one of grief. It travels through the spaces of heaven. She listens to its wailing echoes as she falls, and as she falls toward the sea where the dark angels are waiting for her. And as she falls, she leans with reverted neck and strives to see their faces, and as she nears them she distinguishes one. "Save me, save me," she cried, and, bewildered and dazed with the dream, she stared on the room, now chill with summer dawn. Again she murmured, "It was only a dream, it was only a dream." Again a sort of presentiment of happiness spread like light through her mind, and again the voice within her said, "But all was not a dream. There was something that was worse than the dream." And with despair in her heart she sat watching the cold sky turn to blue, the delicate bright blue of morning, and the garden grow into yellow and purple and red. She did not weep, nor did she moan. She sat thinking. She dwelt on the remembrance of the hills and the tramp with strange persistency, and yet no more now than before did she attempt to come to conclusions with her thought. It was vague, she would not define it. She brooded over it sullenly and obtusely. Sometimes her thoughts slipped away from it, but within each returning a fresh stage was marked in the progress of her nervous despair. And so the hours went by. At 8 o'clock the maid knocked at the door. Kitty opened it mechanically, and she fell into the woman's arms, weeping, sobbing. The sight of the female face brought relief. It interrupted the jarred and strained sense of the horrible. The secret affinities of sex quickened within her. The woman's presence filled Kitty with the feelings that the harmlessness of a lamb or a soft bird inspires. End of John Norton, Chapter 11. Recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 12 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. But what is it, miss? What is it? Are you ill? Why, miss, you haven't taken your things off. You haven't been to bed. No, I lay down. I have had frightful dreams, that is all. But you must be ill, miss. You look dreadful, miss. Shall I tell Mr. Hare? Perhaps the doctor had better be sent for. No, no, pray say nothing about me. Tell my father that I did not sleep, that I am going to lie down for a little while, that he is not to expect me for breakfast. I really think, miss, that it would be as well for you to see the doctor. No, no, no. I am going to lie down, and I am not to be disturbed. Shall I fill the bath, miss? Shall I leave the hot water here, miss? Bath? Hot water? Kitty repeated the words over as if she were striving to grasp a meaning, but which eluded her. Soon after the maid returned with a tray. The trivial jingle of the cups and plates was another suffering added to the ever-increasing stress of mind. Her dress was torn, it was muddy, there were bits of furs sticking to it. She picked these off, and as she did so, accurate remembrance and simple recollection of facts returned to her, and the succession was so complete that the effect was equivalent to a re-enduring of the crime, and with a foreknowledge of it as if to sharpen its horror and increase the sense of pollution. The vague hills, the vague sea, the sweet glow of evening, she saw it all again, and as if afraid that her brain, now strained like a body on the rack, would suddenly snap, she threw up her arms and began to take off her dress, as if she would hush thought in abrupt movements. In a moment she was in stays and petticoat. The delicate and almost girlish arms were disfigured by great bruises. Great black and blue stains were spreading through the skin. Kitty lifted up her arm. She looked at it in surprise. Then in horror she rushed to the door where her dressing-gown was hanging, and wrapped herself in it tightly, hid herself in it so that no bit of her flesh could be seen. End of John Norton, Chapter 12. Recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 13 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. The day grew into afternoon. She awoke from a dreamless sleep of about an hour, and still under its soothing influence, she pinned up her hair, settled the ribbons of her dressing-gown, and went downstairs. She found her father and John in the drawing-room. "Oh, here is Kitty!" they exclaimed. "But what is the matter, dear? Why are you not dressed?" said Mr. Hare. "But what is the matter? Are you ill?" said John, and he extended his hand. "No, no, 'tis nothing," she replied, and avoiding the outstretched hand with a shudder, she took the seat furthest away from her father and lover. They looked at her in amazement, and she at them in fear and trembling. She was conscious of two very distinct sensations, one the result of reason, the other of madness. She was not ignorant of the causes of each, although she was powerless to repress one in favour of the other. She knew she was looking at and talking to her dear, kind father, and that the young man sitting next to him was John Norton, the son of her dear friend Mrs. Norton. She knew he was the young man who loved her, and whom she was going to marry. At the same time she seemed to see that her father's kind, benign countenance was not a real face, but a mask which he wore over another face, and which, should the mask slip, and she prayed that it might not, would prove as horrible and revolting as... But the mask that John wore was as nothing. It was the veriest make-believe, and she could not but doubt now but that the face she had known him so long by was a fictitious face, and as the hallucination strengthened, she saw his large mild eyes grow small, and that vague dreamy look turn to the dull liquorish look. The chin came forward, the brows contracted, the large sinewy hands were, oh, so like. Then reason asserted itself, the vision vanished, and she saw John Norton as she had always seen him. But was she sure that she did? Yes, yes, but her head seemed to be growing lighter, and she did not appear to be able to judge things exactly as she should. A sort of new world seemed to be slipping like a painted veil between her and the old. John and Mr. Hare looked at her. John at length rose, and he said, "My dear Kitty, I am afraid you are not well." She strove to allow him to take her hand, but she could not overcome the instinctive feeling which caused her to shrink from him. "Don't come near me, I cannot bear it," she cried. "Don't come near me, I beg of you." More than this she could not do, and giving way utterly, she shrieked and rushed from the room. She rushed upstairs. She stood in the middle of the floor listening to the silence, her thoughts falling about her like shaken leaves. It was as if a thunderbolt had destroyed the world and left her alone in a desert. The furniture of the room, the bed, the chairs, the books she loved, seemed to have become as grains of sand, and she forgot all connection between them and herself. She pressed her hands to her forehead and strove to separate the horror that crowded upon her. But all was now one horror. The lonely hills were in the room, the grey skies, the green firs, the tramp. She was again fighting furiously with him, and her lover and her father and all sense of the world's life grew dark in the storm of madness. A step was heard on the stairs. Her quick ears caught the sound, and she rushed to the door to lock it, but she was too late. John held it fast. "Kitty, Kitty," he cried, "for God's sake tell me what is the matter." Save me," she cried, and she forced the door against him with her whole strength. He was, however, determined on questioning her, on seeing her, and he passed his head and shoulders into the room. Save me, help, she cried, retreating from him. "Kitty, Kitty, what do you mean? Say, save me, oh, mercy, mercy, let me go, and I will never say I saw you. I will not tell anything. Let me go," she cried, retreating towards the window. "For heaven's sake, Kitty, take care, the window, the window." But Kitty heard nothing, knew nothing, was conscious of nothing but a mad desire to escape. The window was lifted high, high above her head, and her face distorted with fear, she stood amid the soft greenery of the Virginia creeper. "Save me," she cried. The white dress passed through the green leaves, and John heard a dull thud. End of John Norton, Chapter 13. Recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 14 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. Mr. Hare stood looking at his dead daughter. John Norton sat by the window. His brain was empty, everything was far away. He saw things moving, but they were all far away. He could not reknit himself with the wort of life. The thread that had made him part of it had been snapped. He knew that Kitty had thrown herself out of the window and was dead. The word shocked him, but there was no sense of realization to meet it. She had walked with him on the hills, she had accompanied him as far as the Burg. She had waved her hand to him before they walked quite out of each other's sight. Now she was dead. Had he loved her? Why was there neither burning grief nor tears? He envied the hard-sobbing father's grief, the father who held his dead daughter's hand and showed a face on which was printed so deeply the terror of the soul's emotion that John felt a supernatural awe creep upon him, felt that his presence was a sort of sacrilege. He crept downstairs. He went into the drawing-room and looked about for the place he had last seen her in. She usually sat on that sofa. How often he had seen her sitting there. And now he should not see her any more. Only 3 days ago she had been sitting in that basket chair. How well he remembered her words, her laughter. Shadow-like is human life. One moment it is here, the next it is gone. Her work basket, the very ball of wool which he had held for her to wind, the novel which she had lent to him and which he had forgotten to take away. He would never read it now, or perhaps he should read it in memory of her whom yesterday he had parted with on the hills. Her little Puritan look, her external girlishness, her golden brown hair, and the sudden laugh so characteristic of her. She had lent him this book, she who was now but clay. He took up his hat and set forth to walk home across the downs, all the while thinking over what had happened. He had asked her to be his wife. She had consented, and, alarmed at the prospect of the new duties he had contracted, he had returned home. These newly contracted duties had stirred his being to its very depth. The chance appearance of a gypsy girl, without the aid of that circumstance he felt he would never have spoken, and set his life about with endless eventuality. He could not see to the end. The future he had indefinitely plighted, and his own intimate and personal life had been abandoned forever. He had exchanged it for the life of the hearth, of the family, that private life, private and yet so entirely impersonal, which he had hitherto loathed. He had often said he had no pity for those who accepted burdens and then complained that they had not sufficient strength to carry them. Such had been his theory. He must now make his theory and practice coincide. He had walked up and down his study, his mind aflame. He had sat in his armchair facing the moonlight, considering a question, to him so important, so far-reaching, that his mind at moments seemed as if like to snap, to break, but which was accepted by 9/10 of humanity without a second thought, as lightly as the most superficial detail of daily life. But how others acted was not his concern. He must consider his own competence to bear the burden, the perilous burden he had asked and which had been promised to him. He must not adventure into a life he was not fitted for. He must not wreck another's life. In considering himself he was considering her. Their interests were mutual, they were identical. There was no question of egotism. But this marriage question had been debated 1,000 times in the last 6 months. It had haunted his thought. It had become his daily companion, his familiar spirit. Under what new aspect could be considered this question? It faced him always with the same unmovable, mysterious eyes in which he read nothing, which told him nothing of what he longed to know. He only knew that he had desired this girl as a wife. A desire had come he knew not whence. And he asked himself if it were a passing weakness of the flesh, or if this passion abided in him, if it had come at last to claim satisfaction. On this point he was uncertain. This was nature's secret. In the midst of his stress of mind his eyes had wandered over his books. They had been caught by the colour of a small thin volume, and, obeying an instinct, he had taken the volume down. He knew it well, a few hundred small pages containing the wisdom of great Greek philosopher Epictetus. And John had often before turned to this sage discourse for relief in his mental depressions and despair of life. The subject for the good and wise man is his master faculty, as the body is for the physician and the trainer, and the soil is the subject for the husbandman. And the work of the good and wise man is to use appearances according to nature. For it is the nature of every soul to consent to what is good and reject what is evil, and to hold back about what is uncertain. And thus to be moved, to pursue the good and avoid the evil, and neither way for what is neither good nor evil. In the light of these words John's mind grew serene as a landscape on which the moon is shining, and he asked himself why he had hesitated if marriage were the state which he was destined to fulfill. If a habit affects us, against that must we endeavour to find some remedy? And what remedy is to be found against a habit? The contrary habit. A temptation of the flesh had come upon him. He had yielded to it instead of opposing it with the contrary habit of chastity. For chastity had never afflicted him. It had ever been to him a source of strength and courage. Chastity had brought him peace of mind, but the passion to which he had in a measure yielded had robbed him of his peace of mind, and had given him instead weakness and agitation of spirit and flesh. The last 6 months had been the unhappiest of his life. Nothing in this world, he thought, is worth our peace of mind, and love robs us of that, therefore it must be maleficent. And this passion which has caused me so much trouble, what is it? A passing emotion of which I am ashamed, of which I would speak to no one. An emotion which man shares with the lowest animals, but which his higher nature teaches him to check and subject. Then he remembered that this emotion might come upon him again. But each time he thought, I shall be able to control it better than the last, and it will grow weaker and weaker until at last it will pass, and to return no more. But he had proposed to Kitty and had been accepted, and for some solution of this material difficulty he had to fall back upon the argument that he had no right to wreck another's life, that in considering his interests he was considering hers, and he had stood in the dawn light pondering a means of escape from a position into which a chance circumstance had led him. He had gone to bed hoping to find counsel in the night, and in the morning he had waked firm in his resolve and had gone to Shoreham in the intention of breaking his engagement. But instead he had witnessed a cruel and terrible suicide, the reason of which was hidden from him. Possibly none would ever know the reason. Perhaps it were better so. The reasons that prompted suicide were better unrevealed. And now, as he returned home after the tragedy, about midway in his walk across the downs, the thought came upon him that the breaking off of his engagement might have been sufficient reason in an affected mind for suicide. But this was not so. He knew it was not so. He had been spared that. "She was here with me yesterday," he said. And he looked down the landscape now wrapped in a white mist. The hills were like giants sleeping, the long distance vanished in mysterious moonlight. He could see Brighton, nearer was Southwick, and further away past the shadowy shore was Worthing. He sat down by the blown hawthorn bush that stands by the burgh. A ship sailed across the rays of the moon, and he said, "Illusion, illusion, so it is always with him who places his trust in life. Ah, life, life, what hast thou for giving save deceptions? Why did I leave my life of contemplation and prayer to enter into that of desire? Did I not know that there was no happiness save in calm and contemplation, and foolish is he who places his happiness in the things of this world?" But what had befallen her? She was mad when she threw herself out of the window to escape from him. But how had she become mad? Yesterday he had looked back and had seen her walking away and waving her parasol, a slight happy figure on the gold tinted sky. What had happened? By what strange alienation of the brain, by what sudden snapping of the sense had madness come? Something must have happened. Did madness fall like that, like a bolt from the blue? If so, she must have always been mad, and walking home the slight thread of sense half worn through had suddenly snapped. He knew that she liked him. Had she guessed that when it came to the point that he would not, that he might not have been able to marry her? If so, he was in a measure responsible. Ah, why had he ventured upon a path which he must have known he was not fitted to walk in? End of John Norton, chapter 14. Recording by James Carson. John Norton, chapter 15 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. Next morning John and Mrs. Norton drove to the rectory, and without asking for Mr. Hare, they went to her room. The windows were open. Annie and Mary Austin sat by the bedside watching. The blood had been washed out of the beautiful hair, and she lay very white and fair amid the roses her friends had brought her. She lay as she had lain in one of her terrible dreams, quite still, the slender body covered by a sheet. From the feet the linen curved and marked the inflections of the knees. There were long flowing folds, low-lying like the wash of retiring water. And beautiful indeed were the rounded shoulders, the neck, the calm and bloodless face, the little nose, and the drawing of the nostrils, the extraordinary waxen pallor, the eyelids laid like rose-leaves upon the eyes that death had closed forever. An ascension lily lay within the arm in the pale hand. Candles were burning, and the soft smell of wax mixed with the perfume of the roses, for there were roses everywhere, great snowy bouquets and long lines of scattered blossoms, and single roses there and here, and the petals falling were as tears shed for the beautiful dead, and the white flowerage vied with the pallor and the immaculate stillness of the dead. When they next saw her she was in her coffin. It was almost full of white blossoms, jasmine, Eucharis lilies, white roses, and in the midst of the flowers the hands lay folded, and the face was veiled with some delicate filmy handkerchief. For the funeral there were crosses and wreaths of white flowers, roses and stephanotis, and the Austin girls and their cousins, who had come from Brighton and Worthing, carried loose flowers. Down the short drive, through the iron gate, through the farm gate, the bearers staggering a little under the weight of lead, the little cortege passed 2 by 2. A broken-hearted lover, a grief-stricken father, and a dozen sweet girls, their eyes and cheeks streaming with tears. Kitty, their girl-friend, was dead. The word dead rang in their hearts in answer to the mournful tolling of the bell. The little byway along which they went, the little green path leading over the hill, was strewn with blossoms fallen from the bier and the fingers of the weeping girls. The old church was all in white, great lilies in vases, wreaths of stephanotis, and above all roses. Great garlands of white roses had been woven, and they hung along and across. A blossom fell, a sob sounded in the stillness. An hour of roses, an hour of sorrow, and the coffin sank out of sight. A snowdrift of delicate bloom descended into the earth. End of John Norton, Chapter 15. Recording by James Carson. John Norton, Chapter 16 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. John wandered through the green woods and fields into the town. He stood by the railway gates. He saw the people coming and going in and out of the public houses, and he watched the trains that whizzed past. A train stopped, he took a ticket and went to Brighton. He walked through the southern sunlight of the town. The brown sails of the fishing boats waved in translucid green, and the white field of the sheer cliff and all the roofs, gables, spires, balconies, and the green of the verandas were exquisitely indicated and elusive in the bright air. And the beach was loud with acrobats and comic minstrels, and nursemaids lay on the pebbles reading novels. Children with their clothes tied tightly about them were busy building sand castles. But he saw not these things. On his mind was engraved a little country cemetery, graves, hews, a square, impressive spire. He heard not the laughter and the chatter of the beach, but the terrible words, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the dread, responsive rattle given back by the coffin lid. And these, his soul cried, are the true realities, death, and after death heaven or hell. Then he wondered at the fate that had led him from his calm student life. He had come to Thornby Place with the intention of founding a monastery. Instead, he had fallen in love. The word shocked him, and he asked himself if he had ever thought of her more as a wife than as a sister. If he could have been her husband. He feared that he had adventured perilously near to a life of which he could nowise sustain or fulfill, to a life for which he knew he was nowise suited, and which might have lost him his soul. He never could have married her. No, not when it came to the point. He thought of the wedding breakfast, the cake, the speeches, the congratulations, and of the woman with whom he would have gone away, of the honeymoon, of the bridal chamber. He knew now that he could not have fulfilled the life of marriage. If those things had happened, he would have had to tell her, when it was too late, that he was mistaken, that he could not, in any real sense of the word, be her husband. They could not have lived together. They would have had to part. His life and hers would have been irretrievably ruined. And then... John remembered the story of Abelard and Heloise. A new Abelard, a new Heloise. The romance of the idea interested him. Then, returning suddenly to reality, he asked himself what had happened to Kitty. What was the cause of her madness? Something had occurred. Once again, as he remembered the blithe innocence of her smiling eyes when they parted on the hill, and he recalled with terror the trembling, forlorn, half-crazy girl that had sat opposite him in the drawing-room next day. He remembered the twitch of her lips, the averted eyes, and the look of mad fear that had crept over her face, her flight from him, her cries for help, and her desperate escape through the window. His thoughts paused, and then, like a bolt from the blue, a thought fell into his mind. "No," he cried, "not that." He tried to shake himself free from the thought. It was not to be shaken off. That was the explanation. It could only be that. It was that, and nothing but that. And as he viewed the delicate, elusive externality of the southern town, he remembered that he had kissed her. He had kissed her by force. My God! Then the difference between us is only one of degree, and the vilest humanity claims kinship of instinct with me. He clasped his hands across his eyes, and feeling himself on the brink of madness, he cried out to God to save him. And he longed to speak the words that would take him from the world. Life was not for him. He had learnt his lesson. Thornby Place should soon be Thornby Abbey, and in the divine consolation of religion, John Norton hoped to find escape from the ignominy of life. End of John Norton, Chapter 16, recording by James Carson. Agnes Layens, Chapter 1 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. A grey winter morning filtered through lace curtains into drawing-rooms, typical of a fashionable London neighbourhood and a moderate income. There was neither excess of porcelain, nor of small tables, nor of screens. 2 large vases hinted at some vulgarity of taste. A grand piano in the back room suggested a love of music, and Mrs. Layens had but to sing a few notes to leave no doubt that she had bestowed much care on the cultivation of her voice. But method only disguised its cracks and thinness as powder and rouge did the fading and withering of her skin. She was like her voice. Lord Chadwick stood behind her, following the music bar by bar, and with an interest and a pleasure that did not concord with his appearance, for there was nothing in his appearance to indicate that his intelligence was on a higher plane than that of the mess room. His appearance seemed to fluctuate between the mess room and the company promoter's office. He was a good-looking solicitor. He was a good-looking officer. The eyes were attractive. The nose was too large, but it was well shaped, A heavy military moustache curled over his cheeks, and as he stood nodding his head, delighted with the music, the seeming commonness of his appearance wore away. Her song finished, Mrs. Lahens got up from the piano. She was tall and well made, perhaps too full in the bosom, perhaps too wide in the hips, and perhaps the smallness of the waist was owing to her stays. Her figure suggested these questions. She wore a fashionable lilac blue silk pleated over the bosom, and round her waist a chatelaine, to which was attached a number of trinkets, a purse of gold net, a pencil case, some rings, a looking glass, and small gold boxes jewelled, probably containing powder. Her hair was elaborately arranged, as if by the hairdresser, and she exhaled a faint odour of heliotrope as she crossed the room. She was still a handsome woman. She once had been beautiful, but too obviously beautiful to be really beautiful. There was nothing personal or distinguished in her face. It was made of two well-known shapes, the long, ordinary, clear-cut nose, and the eyes, forehead, and cheeks, and chin proportioned according to the formula of the casts in vestibules. That she was slightly déclassée was clear in the first glance, and she represented all that the word could be made to mean: liaisons, familiarity with fashionable restaurants, and the latest French literature. Lord Chadwick saw that she was out of temper, and wondered what was the cause. He had not yet spoken to her. She was singing when he came into the room, so laying his hand on her shoulder he said, "What is the matter, Olive?" But it was some time before he could get an answer. At last she said, "I had an unpleasant scene with the Major this morning." "I am glad it is no more than that." And Lord Chadwick threw himself into an armchair. "What further eccentricity has he been guilty of? Does he want to sweep the crossing, or to wait at table in the crossing sweeper's clothes? He has bought an old overcoat from the butler." "And wants to wear it at lunch?" "No, he's got a new suit. I insisted on that. It came home last night. He had to give way, for I told him that if he would come down to lunch he must come decently dressed, otherwise he would do Agnes a great deal of harm." "But you couldn't persuade him to stick to his typewriting and keep out of the way?" "No, and I thought it better not to try. Agnes's return home has excited him dreadfully, and he fancies that it is his duty to watch over her, to protect her from my friends." "Then I suppose we shall never get rid of him. He'll be here all day, night and day. Good heavens!" "I don't say that. I hope that this new idea of his is only a freak. He will soon tire of his task of censor of morals. Meanwhile we are to be most guarded in our conversation. And as for you—" "What has he against me?" And Lord Chadwick looked at Mrs. Lahens. "About me," he repeated. "Nonsense. I don't mean that he's jealous, but he thinks that we should not continue to see one another." "Does he give any reason?" "Agnes is coming home to day. I shall have to take her into society. He says that society will not stand it unless our relations are broken off." "Society has stood it for the last 7 years. Society will stand anything except the divorce court, and there's no danger of that." "The Major's very queer. I don't know what's the matter with him. I never saw him go on as he did this morning. He says that the girl shall not be sacrificed if he can help it." "You don't think he'll make a row, do you?" "Are you afraid?" "Of what?" "For your sake I shouldn't like a row." "Afraid of a madman like that? But he can do nothing. I don't see what he can do." "That's what he said himself. He says he can do nothing. You should have seen him walking up and down the room, dressed in a suit of clothes out of a rag shop, yellow-grey things 2 sizes too big for him. He has to roll up the ends of the trousers. He had no collar on, and to keep his neck warm he had tied an old pink scarf round his throat. He couldn't walk either way above a couple of yards, for the roof slants down almost to the floor. He knocked his head against the roof, but he did not mind. He went on talking, half to me, half to himself. He sent for you then? Yes, that he'd like to see me upstairs. I told my maid to say that he has to come down to my room. But she brought back word that the Major couldn't come down, would I go up to him. So I had to go up to his garret. You never saw such a place. At last I got tired of listening to him. I couldn't stand there in the cold any longer. I was catching cold. But you haven't told me what he said. The usual thing, that it was the loss of his money that had brought him where he was, that if he only had a little money, if he could only keep himself, he would take his daughter away to live with him. He didn't know what would become of her in this house. Oh, he did go on. At last he burst into tears. He threw himself at my feet and said he'd forgive me everything if I'd only think of my daughter. What did you say? I said the best way to consider his daughter's interests was by avoiding all scandal and wearing proper clothes. And he promised he would wear the new suit? Yes, he promised he would. He said that he knew all I said was true, that it wasn't my fault, that a woman couldn't be expected to respect a man who couldn't keep her, that he felt the shame of his position in the house, that it had broken his heart, that if he had lost his money it was not his fault, that the world was full of rogues, you know. You've heard him go on. I should think I had. I don't know how I put up with him. Very often it is as much as I can do to prevent myself from running out of the room." Mrs. Lahens looked at her lover angrily. "You don't think what I have to put up with. You come here when you like, you go away when you like. Men are always the same, they only think of themselves. You don't think of me. You do not remember what I have to put up with for your sake, of the sacrifices I have made for you. I should have left him years ago when he lost his money, if it hadn't been for fear of compromising you. He never would have divorced you. He'd have been left without a cent if he had, and he couldn't have got anything out of me. Whatever my husband's faults are, he's not mercenary. There are many who think more of money and its advantages than he. Now, what are you angry about, Olive?" And Lord Chadwick laid his hand on her shoulder. "I don't like unjust accusations, not even against my husband. The Major is a fool, but he is not dishonourable. He is the most honourable man that comes into this house. It was not on account of my money that he did not divorce me." "On account of you, then?" "Partly, strange as that may seem to you, and on account of his daughter." Lord Chadwick did not answer. The conversation was taking a disagreeable turn, and as he looked into the fire he thought how he might change it. "So Agnes returns home to day?" "Yes, her father insisted. She, poor dear, begged and prayed to be allowed to become a nun, but he would not listen to her any more than he would to me. There was no use arguing. You know what the Major is. You're never sure when he'll turn on you. If I oppose him, he might come down some evening when there was a party, and inform my guests that I kept my daughter imprisoned in a convent, that I wouldn't let her out. No, I daren't oppose him on this point. Agnes must come home for a while. But the experiment won't succeed. I dare say you think so too. But for all that I'm right, as time will prove. A mother knows more about her own daughter than any one else, and I tell you that Agnes is no more fitted for the world than I am for a convent. I shall have to drag her about for a season or two. She won't succeed, and she'll be wretchedly unhappy. I shall be put to any amount of trouble and expense. That will be all." "And then?" "I don't know. Even if I did give you up, I don't see what would be gained. All I could do would be to ask you not to come to the house any more." "That is nonsense." "Of course it is nonsense. Can I go back on my whole life? Can I change all my friends? If I did I should only collect more exactly like them, and without knowing I was doing it. Lie low for a month or so, and then pursue the same old way. With the best intentions in the world we cannot change ourselves. But you don't intend to give me up, Olive?' 'Do you want me to, Reggie?' 'No, dearest. We've held together a long time, 7 years. We cannot give each other up.' 'We can't give each other up,' said Mrs. Lahens. 'It never shall be broken off unless you break it off.' Lord Chadwick asked himself if he desired to break with her. He looked at her, and thought he had never seen her look so old. But he could not imagine his life without her. Apart from her there was nothing for him. His name had been mixed up in questionable city transactions, his wife had divorced him, and he was over 40. Notwithstanding his title, he'd find it difficult to marry a girl with money. He couldn't marry one without. Besides, he loved Olive as well as a man could love a woman whose lover he had been for 7 years. Mrs. Lahens looked at him and wondered what there was in him that attracted her so firmly. They had once loved each other passionately. All that was over now, but still she loved him. He was all she had in the world. To live with her husband without Reggie! No, she could not think of it. Even if she did, Agnes would profit nothing by it. Every one knew of her liaison. No one talked about it any more, it had been in a way accepted, and for them to separate would only serve to set Mayfair gossiping again. 'I know I appear selfish,' she said. 'Not to want to see my daughter must seem selfish. But I'm not selfish, Reggie. I've never been selfish where you have been concerned, have I? I at least can't accuse you of selfishness, Olive. You've always been a good friend to me. There was my bankruptcy.' 'Do not speak of it. I only did for you what you would have done for me. I have been very unlucky. I was cursed with a husband who was a fool, and who lost all his money. No one can say he's in his right mind. They say that I have driven him out of his mind, but that is not so. You know that is not so. I've not driven you out of your mind. There never was such a fool as my husband. He has acted as stupidly about his daughter as he did about his money. First he takes her away from me. I'm not good enough for her, this house isn't good enough for her. He shuts her up in a convent, and never has her home for fear she should hear or see anything that was not pious and good. Then, when she wants to become a nun, and her mind is made up, and her character is formed, he insists that she shall come home, and that I shall give up my lover and bring her into society. But not into the society that comes to my house, but into some other society, some highly respectable society that neither he nor I knows anything about. And to make my task the more easy, he insists on living in a servant's room, buying the butler's overcoat, and running down the street, whistling for cabs and carrying my trunks on his shoulder. There never was such madness. God knows how it will all end.' She turned her head slightly when her husband entered the room, and, without getting off the arm of Lord Chadwick's chair, said, 'Doesn't he look well in that suit of clothes, Reggie?' The Major was a short man, shorter by nearly 2 inches than his wife or Lord Chadwick. His hair had once been red, it was now faded, and the tall forehead showed bald amid a slight gleaming. His beard and moustaches were thick, unkempt, and full of grey hair. The nose was small and aquiline, and the eyes, shallow and pale blue, wore a silly and vacant stare. The skin was coloured everywhere alike, a sort of conventional tone of flesh colour seemed to have been poured over the face, forehead, and neck. His short, thick hands were covered with reddish hair. They fidgeted at the trousers and waistcoat, too tightly strained across his little round stomach, and he did not desist till his wife said, 'I hope you will have finished dressing before our guests arrive.' 'Whom have you asked? Not the tall, thin man who—' 'Why not? You surely don't think he is a fit companion for Agnes?' 'Companion for Agnes! No, but I don't intend every one that comes here to lunch as a companion for Agnes. I'm sick of hearing of that girl. I've heard of nothing else for the last week. The people she should meet, what we should say and not say before her. If we aren't good enough for her, she should have remained in the convent. But what fault, may I ask, do you find with Moulton?' 'Only what you've told me. Am I right, Reggie?' 'Oh, Reggie will agree with you. He hates Moulton. I don't like the man.' 'The truth is that he sent a note asking if he might come, and I knew if I refused he'd have nothing to eat. You ought to be able to judge Moulton more fairly, for it is want of money that has reduced him to his present position. He was born a gentleman, and his uncle only allows him 15 shillings a week. This pays for his lodging, one room, which costs 5 shillings a week, another 5 shillings a week goes for current expenses, a cup of tea in the morning, and a few omnibus fares. The remaining 5 shillings goes towards his clothes. So every day he finds himself face to face with the problem where he shall lunch, where he shall dine. He's good looking, women like him, and any little present they make him is welcomed, I can assure you. He said the other day, "Look at my boot, there's a hole in it. I shall be laid up with a cold. You don't know what it is to be ill in a room for which you pay 5 shillings a week." What could I do but to tell him that he might order a pair at my shoemaker's?' 'And he ordered a pair that cost £3,' said Lord Chadwick. 'Yes, I did think that he might have chosen a cheaper pair. But you're rather hard on him,' said Mrs. Lahens. 'He's not the only man in London who takes money from women.' 'I wonder he doesn't go to Mashonaland or to Canada,' said the Major. 'If every one who could not make his living here went to Mashonaland or Canada, the London drawing rooms would be pretty empty.' 'You mean that for me, Olive?' said the Major. 'I would go to morrow to Mashonaland if I were as young as Moulton.' At that moment a youngish looking man, about 35, came into the room quickly. Notwithstanding the wintry weather he was clad in a light grey summer suit. He wore a blue shirt and a blue linen tie, neatly tied and pinned. Mrs. Lahens, the Major and Reggie glanced at the boots which had cost £3, and Mrs. Lahens thought how carefully that grey summer suit was folded and laid away in the tiny chest of drawers which stood next the wall by the little window. Mr. Moulton was clean shaved. His features were long and regular, a high Socratic forehead suggested an intelligence which his conversation did not confirm. His manners were stagey, and there was a hollow cordiality in the manner in which he said 'How do you do?' and shook hands. Immediately his blue, superficial, glassy eyes were turned to Mrs. Lahens, and he studied her figure in her new gown, and whispered that he had never seen her looking better. 'So there he is, and in his new clothes. Curious little fellow he is,' said Moulton, eyeing the Major. 'Did he offer much resistance? You don't seem torn at all, not a scratch.' 'I did all I could to dissuade him, but I know, suffering from daughter on the brain. Tell me, shall we see much of him? Will he come down every day to lunch? And what about dinner?' 'I hope not, I think not. He has his typewriting to attend to. At all events the mystery is cleared up. I don't think I ever was believed when I said that I had once spoken to him on the stairs. Do you hear that, Major? Mr. Moulton says he doesn't think he ever was believed when he said that he had once spoken to you on the staircase. Major, do you hear?' 'Yes, dear, I hear. But I am talking to Reggie about Miss Lahens. By the way, Mr. Moulton, my daughter, Miss Lahens, is coming home to day, so I hope that you'll be guarded in your conversation and will say nothing that a young girl may not hear.' 'I shall be very pleased to see Agnes again,' said Moulton. 'If I had thought of it I would have read up the lives of the saints. I beg, Mr. Moulton, that you do not speak disrespectfully of Miss Lahens. Perhaps there is nothing in your conversation that is fit for her to hear.' Moulton looked at Mrs. Lahens, then, taking in the situation, he said, 'If I have the pleasure of talking to Miss Lahens, I shall confine my conversation to those subjects with which she is familiar. I shall acquit myself better than you, I think, Major. I have a sister who is a nun. I know a good deal about convents." "I'm glad to hear it," said the Major. "I wanted you to know that my daughter has been very strictly brought up." "My dear Major," said Mrs. Lahens, "you had better write on a piece of paper, 'My daughter, Miss Lahens, comes home from school to day, and my guests at lunch are particularly requested to be guarded in their conversation.' You can put it up where every one can see it, then there can be no mistake. The only disadvantage of this will be that at the end of the week Agnes will be the talk of the town. If Lilian Dare were to hear you, she would " "But you haven't asked her." "Why not? She's received everywhere." "Not when there are young girls. You know how she got her money." "Oh yes, we've all heard that story," said Mrs. Lahens, and before the Major could reply the servant announced, "Miss Lahens and Father White." "Who is Father White?" whispered Moulton. "I haven't the least idea," said Mrs. Lahens. End of Agnes Lahens, Chapter 1, recording by James Carson. Agnes Lahens, Chapter 2 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. Agnes wore a jacket made of some dark material. She held a little fur muff in her hand, and under a black straw hat her blue eyes smiled. And when she caught sight of her mother she uttered a happy cry. Mrs. Lahens looked at Agnes curiously, at this thin girl, for, though Agnes's face was round and rosy, her waist was slender and her hands and hips and bosom. And Mrs. Lahens was unconsciously affected by the contrast that her own regular and painted features and her long life of social adventure presented to this pretty dove-like girl, this pale conventional rose, without instinct of the world, and into whose guileless mind no knowledge of the world would apparently ever enter. "Oh, father, how are you? I did not see you, the room is so dark." Agnes kissed her father, and with her right hand in her mother's left hand, and her left hand in her father's left, she looked at her parents, overcome by her affection for them. But suddenly remembering, she said, "But I haven't introduced you to Father White. How rude of me. Father White was good enough to see me home. The Mother Abbess was afraid I should get into a wrong train or get run over in the streets." The little priest came forward shyly. His black cloth trousers were too short, and did not hide his clumsy laced boots. His features were small and regular, and his light brown hair grew thick on his little round head, which he carried on one side. He was young, 7 or 8 and 20, and so good looking that some unhappy romantic passion suggested itself as the cause of his long black coat and penitential air. "I'm sure that we're very much obliged to you for your kindness, Father White," said Mrs. Lahens. "I was going to London, and the Mother Abbess asked me to take charge of Miss Lahens and surrender her safe into your hands." "Won't you sit down, Father White?" said Mrs. Lahens. "I want to talk to you about Agnes. I hope you will stop to lunch. I wish you would." "Thank you, but I'm afraid I cannot. I have an engagement to lunch with the Dominicans." "I'm sorry, but you can spare me a few minutes," said Mrs. Lahens, leading him away. Lord Chadwick came forward and shook hands with Agnes. "I'm afraid you've forgotten me, Agnes. It is nearly 5 years." "No, I haven't, at least not quite. I was in the country at the cottage in Surrey. You're the gentleman who used to go driving with mother." "Yes, you're right so far. I used to go out driving with Mrs. Lahens. You used to come too. And very often you used to speak French to mother. I never could understand why. I used to think and think." "And do you remember any of the things he used to say in French?" said Mr. Moulton. "No, I didn't understand French then." "But you do now?" "Yes, our school is one of the best. We are taught everything." "I'm sorry for that. There'll be nothing for us to teach you." "For you to teach me?" said Agnes, looking at him inquiringly. At that moment the servant announced Mr. Harding. The Major went forward and welcomed him cordially. "You see, you've lost your bet," Moulton whispered to Harding. "We were very sorry to lose you," said Father White. And she was sorry to leave, but it would not be right for her to take vows to enter a severe order until she has seen the world, and had opportunities of knowing if she has vocation. "On that point I shall be very firm with her. You can rely on me, Mrs. Lahens." "I'm afraid that she will never care for society. I'm afraid that this experience will not prove of much avail. She'll return to the convent. I shall be sorry to lose her." "She's indeed a good girl, and if she finds that she has a vocation—" "Now you're speaking about me," said Agnes. "I can hear the word vocation." Mrs. Lahens smiled and was about to reply when the servant announced Miss Lilian Dare. Lilian was a red blonde. Her rich chestnut hair fell over her ears like wings, and she was showily dressed in an expensive French gown which did not suit her, which made her seem older than she was. "So you have come alone?" "Yes, dear Lady Duckle was not feeling well this morning. She sends you her love and begs you'll excuse her." "Oh yes, we'll excuse her. But tell me, Lilian," said Mrs. Lahens, taking the girl aside, "how do you like living with her?" "It is delightful. You don't know what it means to me to get away from home. All those brothers and sisters, that hateful suburb. You must never speak of it again. Islington, where is that?" "You must say if Islington should happen in the conversation, which is not likely." "I always told you that you'd have to throw your family over. We want you, not your family. Chaperons nowadays are a make believe. Lady Duckle will suit you very well. She'll feel ill when you don't want her. When you do she'll be all there. She's an honest old thing, and will do all that's required of her for the money you pay her. £30 a month. That's it, isn't it, dear?" The servant announced Lady Castlerich. Lady Castlerich disguised her 70 years under youthful gowns and an extraordinary yellow wig. She wore a large black hat trimmed with black ostrich plumes. It became her. She looked quite handsome, and her cracked and tremulous voice was as full of sympathy as her manner was of high breeding. She seemed very fond of Lilian, and was soon engaged in conversation with her. "You mustn't disappoint me, my dear. You must come to my shooting party on the 25th, and dear Lady Duckle, I hope she'll come too, though she is rather a bore. I shall have plenty of beaux for you. There is my neighbour, Lord Westhorpe. He's young and handsome, a beautiful place, Charman, my dear. And if you don't like him, there's my old lover Appletown. You know, my dear, all that is a long while ago. I said to Appletown more than 10 years ago, 'Appletown, this must end. I am an old woman.' You've no idea the look he gave me. 'Florence,' he said, 'don't call yourself an old woman. I can't bear it. You'll never be an old woman, at least not in my eyes.' Charman, wasn't it? No one but a nice man could speak like that. So we've always remained friends. Appletown has his rooms at Morelands, and he does as he likes. He likes you, dear, he told me so. I've got a telegram from him. I'll show it to you after lunch." The servant announced Mr. Herbert St. Clare, a fastidiously dressed man. He was tall and thin, and his eyes were pale and agreeable. His beard was close clipped. He played with his eyeglass and shook hands absent-mindedly. "Oh, Mr. St. Clare, I'm enchanted with your last song," said Lady Castlerich. "Every one is talking of it. It is quite the rage. Charman! I wish I had had it 10 years ago. My voice is gone now." "You still sing charmingly, Lady Castlerich. Not much voice is required if the singer is a musician." "You're very kind," and the old lady laughed with pleasure, and Mrs. Lahens smiled satirically and whispered, "Oh, you fibber, St. Clare." "I'm not fibbing," he answered. "She sings the old Italian airs charmingly." Soon after lunch was announced, and Mrs. Lahens once more asked Father White to stay, he begged her to excuse him, and she went into the dining room, leaving him in the passage with Agnes. "Good bye, my dear child. I shall see you next week. I will write telling you when I'm coming, and you'll tell me what you think of the world. The convent is only for those who have a vocation. You can serve God in the world as well as elsewhere." "I wonder," said Agnes, and she looked doubtfully into the priest's eyes. "I wonder. I confess I am a little curious. At present I do not understand at all." "Of course the convent is very different from the world," said Father White. "You learnt to understand the convent, now you must learn to understand the life of the world." "Must I? Why must I?" "So that you may be sure that you have a vocation. Good bye, dear child. The Lord be with you." Agnes went into the dining room, and she noticed that every one was listening to her father, who was talking of the success her mother had had at a concert. She had sung 2 songs by Gounod and Cherubino's Ave Maria. He declared that he had never seen anything like it. He wished every one had been there. His wife was in splendid voice. It was a treat, and the public thought so too. Agnes listened and was touched by her father's admiration and love for her mother. But very soon she perceived that the others were listening superciliously. Suddenly Mrs. Lahens intervened. "My dear Major, you're talking too much. Remember your promise." The Major said not another word, and Agnes felt sorry for her father. She remembered him far back in her childhood, always a little weak and kind, always devoted to her mother, always praising her, always attending on her, always carrying her music, reminding her of something she had forgotten, and running to fetch it. Looking at him now, after many years, she remembered that she used to see more of him than she did of her mother. He used to come to see her in the nursery, and she remembered how they used to go out together and sit on the stairs, so that they might hear mother, who was singing in the drawing room. She remembered that she used to ask her father why they could not go to the drawing room. He used to answer that mother had visitors. He used to hear men's voices, and then mother would call her father down to wish them good bye. Her memories of her mother were not so distinct. She never saw her mother except on the rare occasions when she was admitted to the drawing room. She remembered her standing in long shining dresses with long trains curled around her feet, which she kicked aside when she advanced to receive some visitor. Or she remembered her mother on the stairs, a bouquet in her hands, a diamond star in her hair. The front door was open, and the lamps of the brougham gleamed in the dark street. Then her mother would kiss her and tell her she must be a good girl, and go to sleep when she went to bed. There had never seemed to be but one person in the house, and that was mother. Where was mother going? To the theatre, to a dinner party, to the opera? And the phrase, "When shall the carriage come to fetch mother?" had fixed itself on her memory. And in her mother's bedroom, the largest and handsomest room in the house, she remembered the maid opening large wardrobes, putting away soft white garments, laces, green silk and pink petticoats, more beautiful than the dresses that covered them. The large white dressing table strewn with curious ivories, the uses of which she could not imagine, had likewise fixed itself on her memory. She remembered the hand glasses, the scattered jewellery, the scent bottles, and the little boxes of powder and rouge, and the pencil with which her mother darkened her eyebrows and eyelids. For Mrs. Lahens had always been addicted to the use of cosmetics, therefore the paint on her mother's face did not shock Agnes as it might otherwise have done. But she could not but notice that it had increased. Her mother's mouth seemed to her now like a red wound. Ashamed of the involuntary comment, Agnes repelled all criticism and threw herself into the belief that all her mother did was right, that she was the best and most beautiful woman in London, that to be her daughter was the highest privilege. Her thoughts were entirely with her parents, and she had hardly spoken to the men on either side of her. Mr. Moulton had asked her if she were glad to come home, if she rejoiced in the prospect of balls and parties, if she were sorry to leave her favourite nun. She had answered his questions briefly, and he had returned to his exchange of gallantries with Lady Castlerich, who he hoped would invite him to Moorlands. Agnes did not quite like him. She liked Mr. St. Clare better. St. Clare had asked her if she sang, and when she told him that she was leading soprano in the convent choir, he had talked agreeably until Miss Dare said, "Now, Mr. St. Clare, leave off flirting with Agnes." Her remark made everyone laugh, and in the midst of the laughter Mrs. Lahens said, "So my little girl is coming out of her shell." "Out of her cell," said Mr. Moulton, laughing. "Out of her what?" asked Lady Castlerich. "You don't know, Lady Castlerich, that my Agnes wanted to become a nun, to enter a convent where they get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to say matins." "Oh, how very dreadful," said Lady Castlerich. "Agnes must come to my shootin' party. Father White, the priest you saw here just now, brought her home. Fortunately he took our side, and he told Agnes she must see the world. It would be time enough a year hence to think if she had a vocation. Mother dear, he said 6 months. What, are you tired of us already, Agnes?" "No, mother, but—" Agnes hung down her head. "Agnes must come to my shootin' party. We must find a young man for her. There is Mr. Moulton, or would you like Mr. St. Clare better? I hope, Mr. Moulton, you'll be able to come to Moorlands on the 25th." Mr. Moulton said that nothing would give him more pleasure, and feeling that Lady Castlerich intended that his charms would for ever obliterate Agnes's conventional aspiration, he leaned towards her and asked her if she knew Yorkshire. Moorlands was in Yorkshire. His conversation was, however, interrupted by Lady Castlerich, who said in her clear cracked voice, "We must put Agnes in the haunted room amid the tapestries." "No, no, don't frighten her," whispered the Major. "But, father, I am not so easily frightened as that." "Who haunts the tapestry room?" "A nun, dear, so they say. Moorlands was a monastery once. A nunnery, I mean. The monastery was opposite." "That was convenient," giggled Mr. Moulton. "And why does the nun haunt the tapestries?" "Ah, my dear, that I can't tell you." "Perhaps the nun was a naughty nun," suggested Mr. Moulton. "Are there no naughty nuns in your convent?" "Oh no, not in my convent. All the sisters are very good. You cannot imagine how good they are," said Agnes, and she looked out of her eyes, so pale and so innocent that he almost felt ashamed. "But what a strange idea that was of yours, Agnes," said Miss Dare across the table, "to want to shut yourself up for ever among a lot of women with nothing else to do but to say prayers. You think like that because you do not know convent life. There is, I assure you, plenty to do, plenty to think about." "Fancy, they hardly ever speak, only at certain hours," said Mrs. Lahens. "It is the getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning that seems to me the worst part," said Miss Dare. "The monotony," said St. Clare, "must be terrible. Always the same faces, never seeing anything new, knowing that you will never see anything else." Agnes listened to these objections eagerly. "The nuns are not sad at all," she said. "If you saw them playing at ball in the garden you would see that they were quite as happy as those who live in the world. I don't know if you are sad in the world. I don't know the world, but I can assure you that there is no sadness in the convent." Agnes paused and looked round. Every one was listening, and it was with difficulty she was induced to speak again. Then, in answer to her mother's questions, she said, "We have our occupations and our interests. They would seem trivial enough to you, but they interest us and we are happy." "There must be," said Lilian, "satisfaction in having something definite to do, to know where you are going and what you are striving for. We don't know what we are striving for or where we are going, and the trouble we give ourselves. Say what you will, it is something to be spared all that." "Yet if we asked the ordinary man," said Harding, "what he'd do if he had 10,000 a year, he would answer that he would do nothing. But he may not. The only man who does nothing is the man who suddenly acquires 10,000 a year. He tries to live on his income. He doesn't. He dies of it. And those who are born rich?" asked Moulton. "They work hard enough, and their work is the hardest of all. Their work is amusement. For by some strange misunderstanding all the most tedious and unsatisfactory means of distraction are termed amusement, betting, gambling, travelling, dinner parties, love making, whereas the valid and sufficient form of distraction, earning your livelihood by the sweat of your brow, is designated by the unpleasant word labour." "But if you are fortunate in love, you're happy," said old Lady Castlerich. "I think I have made many lovers happy." Harding laughed. "Happy? For how long?" "That depends. Love is not a joy that lasts for ever," the old lady added with a chuckle. "But did no woman make you happy, Mr. Harding?" asked Lilian, and she fixed her round prominent eyes upon him. "The woman who gives most happiness gives most pain. The man who leaves an adoring mistress at midnight suffers most. A few minutes of distracted happiness as he drives home. He falls asleep thanking God that he will see her at midday, but he awakes dreading a letter putting him off. He listens for the footstep of a messenger boy. If she doesn't disappoint him? She will disappoint him sooner or later." "I have never disappointed you," said Lilian, still looking at Harding. "But you have not been to see me." "No, I have not been to see you," she replied, and played distractedly with some dried fruit on her plate. "These are confessions," said Lady Castlerich, laughing. "Confessions of missed opportunities," said Moulton. "So, then, your creed is that love cannot endure," said Lord Chadwick. "The love that endures is the heaviest burden of all," Harding replied incautiously. A silence fell over the lunch table, and all feared to raise their eyes lest they should look at Mrs. Lahens and Lord Chadwick. "I suppose you are right," said Mrs. Lahens. "It is not well that anything should outlive its day. But sometimes it happens so. But look," she exclaimed, laughing nervously, "how Agnes is listening to St. Clare. Those two were made for each other. Celibacy and work. Which is celibacy and which is work?" "I think, Olive," said the Major, "that you are rather hard upon the girl. You forget that she has only just come from school and doesn't understand." "My dear Major," said Mrs. Lahens, and her voice was full of contempt for her husband, "is it you or I who has to take Agnes into society? As I told you before, Agnes will have to accept society as it is. She won't find her convent in any drawing room, I know, and the sooner she makes up her mind on that point the better for her and the better for us." "Society will listen for 5 minutes," said Lilian, "to tales of conventional innocence." "And be interested in them," said Lord Chadwick, "as in an account of the last burlesque." "With this difference," said Moulton, "that society will go to the burlesque, but not to the convent." Agnes glanced at her mother, seeing very distinctly the painted, worldly face. That her mother should speak so cruelly to her cut her to the heart, and she longed to rush from the room, from all these cruel, hateful people. Another word and she would have been unable to refrain, but in the few seconds which had appeared an eternity to Agnes, the conversation suddenly changed. Lilian Dare had returned to the idea expressed by Harding that he had only found happiness in work, and this was St. Clare's opportunity to speak of the opera he was writing. "In the first act barbarians are making a raft." "What are they making a raft for?" asked Lady Castlerich. "To get to the other side of a lake. They have no women, and they hope to rob the folk on the other side of theirs." St. Clare explained the various motives he was to employ. The motive of aspiration, or the woman motive, was repeated constantly on the horns during the building of the raft. St. Clare sang the motive. It was with this motive that he began the prelude. Then came two variations on the motive, and then the motive of jealousy. St. Clare was eager to explain the combinations of instruments he intended to employ, and the effect of his instruments on a certain moment, but the servant was handing round coffee and liqueurs, and the story of what happened to the women who were carried off on the raft had to be postponed. St. Clare looked disappointed, but he was in a measure consoled when Lady Castlerich told him that they'd go through the opera together when he came to stay with her for her shooting party. "Won't you sing something, Lilian?" said Mrs. Lahens as they went upstairs. "No, dear, I'd sooner not. But you will." "I'd sooner sing a little later. I don't know where my music is, it has been all put away. But do you sing. St. Clare will accompany you." "Do, to please me." And Mrs. Lahens sat down in a distant corner. She had said that very morning, as she painted her face before the glass, "I am an old woman, or nearly. How many more years? 3 at most, then I shall be like Lady Castlerich," and the 5 minutes she had spent looking into an undyed and unpainted old age had frightened her. She had hated the world she had worshipped so long. She had hated all things, and wished herself out of sight of all things. That she who had been so young, so beautiful, so delightful to men, should become old, ugly, and undesirable. That she should one day be like Lady Castlerich. That such things should happen to others were well enough, that they should happen to her seemed an unspeakable and revolting cruelty. And it was at that moment that her husband had sent for her. He had told her she must give up her lover for her daughter's sake. Should she do this? Could she do this? She did not know, but this she did know, that the present was not the time to speak to her of it. Give him up, hand him over to that horrid Mrs. Priestley, who was trying all she could to get him. Whatever else might be, that should not be. She loved her daughter, and would do her duty by her daughter, but they must not ask too much of her. She had lost her temper, she had said things that she regretted saying. But what matter? What did the poor Major matter, a poor mad thing like him? These were the thoughts that filled Mrs. Lahens' mind while Lilian sang. The purity of Lilian's voice was bitterness to Mrs. Lahens, and it was bitterness to remember that St. Clare loved that face. For no one now loved her face, except perhaps Chad, and they wanted her to give him up. It was the knowledge that the time of her youth was at an end that forced Mrs. Lahens to say that Lilian sang out of tune, and to revive an old scandal concerning her. "Surely, mother," said Agnes, "all you say did not happen to the young girl who has just left the room." End of Agnes Lahens, Chapter 2, recording by James Carson. Agnes Lahens, Chapter 3 of Celibates, by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. Through the house in Grosvenor Street, men were always coming and going. Quite a number of men seemed to have acquired the right of taking their meals there. When Lord Chadwick absented himself, he explained his enforced absence from the table, and Agnes noticed that while Lord Chadwick addressed her mother openly as Olive, Mr. Moulton did so surreptitiously, in a whisper, or when none but their intimate friends were present. They rarely assembled less than 6 or 7 to lunch. After lunch they went to the drawing-room, and the eternal discussion on the relations of the sexes was only interrupted by the piano. St. Clare played better than Lord Chadwick, but Mrs. Lahens preferred Lord Chadwick to accompany her. He followed her voice, always making the most of it. At 5 o'clock the ladies had tea. Very often the men chose brandies and sodas. Cigarettes were permitted, and in these influences all the scandals of the fair ran glibly from the tongue, and surprising were the imaginations of Mrs. Lahens' scandalous brain. The reserve that Agnes's innocence imposed on the wit of the various narratives and on the philosophy of the comments often became painfully irksome, and on noticing Harding's embarrassments, Mrs. Lahens would suggest that Agnes went to her room. Agnes gladly availed herself of the permission, and without the slightest admission to herself that she hated the drawing-room. Such admission would be to impugn her mother's conduct, and Agnes was far too good a little girl to do that. She preferred to remember that she liked her own room. Her mother had let her have a fire there all day. It was a very comfortable room, and she was never lonely when she was alone. She had her books, and there were the dear sisters she had left to think about. Besides, she would meet the men again at dinner, so it would be just as well to have her little store of conversation. She did not want to appear more foolish and ignorant than she could help. After dinner, Mrs. Lahens and Lillian Dare went off somewhere in a hansom. They often went to the theatre. Sometimes Agnes went with them. She had been twice to the theatre. She had been thrilled by a melodrama and pleased by an operetta. But the rest of the party, mother, Mr. Moulton, Lillian, and Mr. St. Clair, had declared that both pieces were very bad, very dull. But they were all anxious to see a comedy about which everyone was talking. They were certain that they would be amused by it, and there was some discussion whether Agnes should be taken. Agnes instantly withdrew from the discussion. She did not care to go, she felt she was not wanted, and she even suspected that she would not like the play. So it was just as well that she was not going. But after dinner it was decided that she was to go. Lord Chadwick was with them. Agnes had never seen him more attentive to her mother, and Mr. St. Clair was absorbed in Lillian. She had, Agnes heard her mother say, succeeded in making him so jealous that he had asked her to marry him. But Mrs. Lahens did not think that Lillian would marry him. Nowadays, girls in society did not often marry their lovers. They knew that the qualities that charm in a lover are out of place in a husband. Agnes sat in the back of the box and wondered why Lillian's refusal to marry St. Clair had made no difference in his affection nor in hers. They seemed as intimate as ever, and Agnes could hear them planning a rendezvous. Lillian was going south, but St. Clair was to meet her in Paris. Agnes wondered. A thought she did not like crossed her mind. She put it instantly aside and bent her attention on the play. There was a great deal in it that she did not understand, or that she only understood vaguely. She did seem to wish to understand it, but the others listened greedily, as well they might, for the conversation on the stage was like the conversation in the Grosvenor Street drawing-room, as like as if a phonograph was repeating it. "I should not make such a fuss if I heard that my dear Major had—" Agnes did not hear the rest of the sentence. "If I were to revenge myself on you, Lillian." "You had better not. Besides, there is nothing to revenge." "Isn't there?" said St. Clair, and his face grew suddenly grave. "You are my first and you'll be my last," Agnes heard her whisper, and she saw St. Clair look at her incredulously. "You don't believe me. Well, I don't care what you believe," and she turned her back on him and listened to the play. And when the play was done, Agnes went home in a hansom, sitting between her mother and Lord Chadwick. St. Clair and Lillian followed in another hansom, and the two hansoms drew up together in Grosvenor Street. After the theatre there was always supper, and Agnes knew that they would sit talking till 1 or 2 in the morning. She was not hungry, she was tired. She asked if she might go to her room. They were all glad to excuse her, and she ran up to her room and closed the door. She threw off her opera cloak hastily, and then stood looking into the fire. Suddenly her brain filled with thoughts which she could not repress, and involuntary sensation crowded upon her. There was the vivid sensation of her mother's painted face. There was the sensation of her father, his strange clothes, his shy, pathetic face. She preferred to think of her father, and she asked herself why he did not go to the theatre with them, why he did not appear oftener at meals. His food was generally taken to him. Where did he live? Up that narrow flight of stairs? She had seen him run up those stairs in strange haste, as if he didn't wish to be seen, like a servant, an under-servant whose presence in the front of the house is discrepant. Suddenly Agnes felt that she was very unhappy, and she unlaced her bodice quickly. The action of unlacing distracted her thoughts. She would not go to bed yet. She took a chair and sat down in front of the fire, thinking. The convent appeared to her clear and distinct in all its quiet life of happy devotion and innocent recreation. She remembered the pleasure she used to take in the work of the sacristy, in laying out the vestments for the priest, for Father White, and in the games at ball in the garden with those dear nuns. She remembered them all, and seen through the tender atmosphere of sorrow, they seemed dearer than ever they had done before. How happy she had been with them! She did not expect ever to be so happy again. The world was so lonely, so indifferent, she was very unhappy, and her life seemed so fragile that the least touch would break it. Her tears flowed as from a crystal, and they did not cease until the silence in the street allowed her to hear her father's quick steps pacing it. She could hear his steps coming from Grosvenor Square. Her poor father! Every night it was the same ceaseless pacing to and fro. She had heard her mother say that he sometimes walked till 3 a.m. She had watched him a night or two ago out of her window. It was freezing hard, and he had on only an old grey suit of clothes, buttoned tightly, and a comforter round his neck. Her father's subordination in the house was one of the mysteries which confronted Agnes. She did not understand, but she knew by instinct that her father was not happy, and her unhappiness went out to his. She pitied him, she longed to make him happier. Others might think him strange, but she understood him. Their talk was strange to her, not his. Last Sunday he had taken her to mass, and they had walked in the park afterwards, and he had been happy until they met Mr. Moulton. A little later they had met her mother and Lord Chadwick. Mr. St. Clare and Miss Lilian Dare had come to lunch. She had seen no more of her father that day. She had hoped that Father White would come and see her, but he had not come. She had sat in her room alone, and after dinner her mother had scolded her because she did not talk to Lord Chiselhurst, an old man who had talked to her in a loud rasping voice. He was overpowering. Her strength had given way, she had fainted, and she had been carried out of the room. When she opened her eyes, St. Clare was standing by her. She was glad it was he and not Lord Chiselhurst who had carried her out. But they would not let her back to the convent before 6 months. She had been a week at home, and it had seemed a century. The time would never pass. She did not think she would be able to endure it for 6 months. Her father did not like her to go back. Was it not her duty to remain by him? He was as unhappy as she, and she was very unhappy. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she cried until her tears were interrupted by the sound of her father's latchkey. She listened to his footsteps as he came upstairs. When he arrived on her landing, instead of going to the end of the passage and up the staircase, he stopped. It seemed as if he were hesitating about something. Agnes wondered and hoped he was coming to see her. A moment after he knocked. "Is that you, father?" "Yes." "Then wait a moment." She slipped her arms into her dressing gown and opened the door to him. "It is nice and snug here," he said, coming towards the fire. "Nice and snug, but bitterly cold in the street. I could not keep warm, yet I walked at the rate of 5 miles an hour. I ran round Grosvenor Square, but the moment I stopped running I began to get cold again. I couldn't keep up the circulation anyhow." "Then sit down and warm yourself, father." "No, thank you. I like standing up best. I'll just stop a minute. I hope I am not in the way. Tell me if I am." "In the way, father? What do you mean?" "Nothing, dear. I only thought." Well, I'll get just the cold out of my bones before I go up to my room. It is cold up there, I can tell you." The girl's keen, passionate eyes looking out of a grief-worn face, and a figure so thin that she looked tall, contrasted with a little fat man dressed in the yellow tweed suit buttoned across his rounding stomach. To see them together by the fire in the bedroom made a strange and moving picture, for the figures seemed united by mysterious analogies, and the fragments of bread and cheese which the Major held in his old blued fingers were significant. "I could hear them singing in the drawing room," he said, "when I came in, so I stepped into the dining room. One feels a bit hungry after walking. How did you like the play, dear?" "Pretty well, father," she answered, and she strove to check the tears which rose to her eyes. "You've been grieving, Agnes. What have you been grieving for? For your convent? Tell me, dear. I can't bear to see you unhappy." "No, father, don't think of me." "Not think of you, Agnes? Of whom should I think, then? Tell me all, everything. If you're not happy here, you shall go back. I won't see you unhappy. It is my fault. Only I thought that you had better come home and see the world first. I had thought that we might have altered things here, just for your sake." "But you, father, you're not happy here. You would be still more unhappy if I went back to the convent. That is true, isn't it?" "Yes, that is true, dear. But you must not think about me. There's no use thinking about me. I'm not worth thinking about." "Don't say that, father. You mustn't speak like that." And unable to control her feelings any longer, Agnes threw herself into her father's arms. And she did not speak until she perceived that her father was weeping with her. "What are you weeping for, father?" "For you, dear, because you're not happy." "There are other reasons," she said, looking inquiringly and tenderly. "No, dear, there's nothing else now in the world for me to grieve for. You must go back to the convent if you're not happy." "But you, father?" "It will be hard to lose you. Things may change. You must have patience. Wait a little while, will you?" "Of course, father, as long as you like. But you'll come down and talk to me here?" "Yes, I should have come oftener, but I know that I am not clever, my conversation isn't amusing, so I stick at my work up there." "You live up there?" "Yes. You've not seen my room. A little room under the slates. Something like a monk's cell. I've often thought of going into a monastery. I dare say it is from me that you get the taste." "You live up there, father. Your room is up there. May I go up and see you sometimes? I shan't be disturbing you at your work, shall I?" "No, I should think not. Just fancy you wishing to come to see me, and up there too." "When may I come, father? When are you least busy?" "You can come now." "May I? We mustn't make any noise. All the servants are asleep." And he held the candle higher for her to see the last steps, and he pushed open a door. "It is here." It was a little loft under the roof, and the roof slanted so rapidly that it was possible to stand upright only in one part of the room. There was in one corner a truckle bed, which Agnes could hardly believe her father slept in, and in the midst of the uncarpeted floor stood the typewriting machine, the working of which the Major at once explained to Agnes. He told her how much he had already earned, and entered into a calculation of the number of hours he would have to work before he could pay off the debt he had incurred in buying the machine. His wife had advanced him the money to buy it. She must be paid back. When that was done he would be able to see ahead, and he looked forward to the time when he would be independent. There were other debts, but the first debt was the heaviest. His wife had advanced the money for the clothes he had worn at the luncheon party, and there was the furniture of his room. But that could not be much. The bed, well, that little iron framework, he had borrowed it. It had come from the kitchen maid's room. She had wanted a larger bed. "But, father dear, you've hardly any bedclothes." "Yes, I have, dear. I have that overcoat, and I sleep very well under it too. I bought it from the butler. I paid him 10 shillings for it, and I made the 10 shillings by copying. The money ought to have gone to your mother, but I have to have something to cover me. It is very cold up here, and I thought I had better keep her waiting than contract a new debt." "But what is mother's is yours, father." "Ah, I've heard people say that, but it isn't true." "How did you lose your money, father?" The Major told her how he had been robbed. "Then it was not your fault, father. And the man who robbed you, you say is now a great swell and very highly thought of." Agnes saw the coarse clothes, the common boots, and the rough comforter, and her eyes wandered round the room, the bare, miserable little attic garret in which he lived. "And with that typewriting machine," she thought, "he is trying to redeem himself from the disrespect he has fallen into because he was robbed of his money. It must be getting very late, father. I had better go to my room." "But, father, you are not comfortable here. Sleep in my room. Let me sleep here." "Let you sleep here, my daughter. Sleep up here among the servants." He stayed a few minutes in her room, and while warming his hands he said, "Everything in the world is dependent on money. We can preserve neither our own nor the respect of others if we have nothing. I have tried. It wasn't to be done." End of Agnes Layens, Chapter 3, recording by James Carson. Agnes Layens, Chapter 4 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. "I'm not disturbing you, father?" "No, dear, you never disturb me," he said, getting up from the typewriter and giving her his chair. "But what is the matter?" "Nothing, at least nothing in particular. I got tired of the drawing room and thought I'd like to come and sit with you. But I've taken your chair." "It doesn't matter, I can stand. I've been sitting so long." "But no, father, I can't take your chair. I don't want to stop you from working. I thought I'd like to sit and watch you. Here, take your chair." "I can get another. I can get one out of the butler's room. He won't mind just for once. He's a very particular man, but I'll tell him I took it for you." The Major returned a moment after with a chair. He gave it to Agnes and resumed his place at the machine. "I shan't be many minutes before I finish this lot," he said. "Then we shall be able to talk. I promised to get them finished this evening." She had never seen a typewriting machine at work before, and admired the nimbleness with which his fingers struck the keys, and the dexterity with which he passed fresh sheets of paper under the roller. When he had finished and was gathering the sheets together, she said, "How clever you are." "I think I picked it up pretty quickly. I can do 70 words a minute. Some typists can do 80, but my fingers are too old for that. Still, 70 is a good average, and I have hardly any corrections to make. They are very pleased with my work." "I'll teach you. You'd soon pick it up." "Will you, father? Then I should be able to assist you. We could sit together, you in that corner, I in this. I wonder if mother would buy me a machine. I could pay her back out of the money I earned, just like you." "Your mother would say you were wasting your time. You've come home, she'd say, to go into society and not to learn typewriting." "I am afraid she would. But, father, there is no use my going into society. I shall never get on in society. Last night at Lord Chiselhurst's—" "Yes, tell me about it. You must have enjoyed yourself there." Agnes did not answer for a long while. At last she said, "There's something, father dear, that I must speak to you about. Mother thinks I ought to marry Lord Chiselhurst, that I ought to make up to him and catch him if I can. She says that he likes very young girls, and that she could see that he liked me. But, father, I cannot marry him. He is... No, I cannot marry him. I do not like him. I'm only 16, and he's 40 or 50. But that isn't the reason, at least not the only reason. I don't want to marry anyone. And mother doesn't seem to understand that. She said if that were so, she really didn't see why I left the convent." She was too intent on what she was saying to notice the light which flashed in the Major's eyes. "I said "Mother, I never wanted to leave the convent. It was you who wanted me home." "No," she said, "it was not I, it was your father. But now that you are here, I should like you to make a good marriage." Then she turned and kissed me. "I don't want to say anything against mother. She loves me, I'm sure. But we're so different. I shall never understand mother. I shall never get on in society. I cannot, father dear, I cannot. I feel so far away. I do not know what to say to the people I meet. I do not feel that I understand them when they speak to me. I am far away. That is what I feel. I shall never get over that feeling. I shall not succeed, and then mother will get to hate me. I am so unhappy, father, I'm so unhappy." Agnes dropped on her knees, and throwing her arms on her father's shoulder, she said, "But father, you're not listening. Listen to me. I've only you. I'm thinking." "Of what?" "Of many things." "Poor father, you have a great deal to think of, and I come interrupting your work. How selfish I am." "No, dear, you're not selfish. I'm very glad you told me. So you think you'll never get on in society." "I don't think I'm suited for society." "I'm afraid you think all society is like our drawing room." "How was it, father, that our drawing room came to be what it is?" "A great deal of it is my fault, dear. When I lost my money I got disheartened, and little by little I lost control. One day I was told that I was paid for nothing. I had no right to grumble. Your mother said, in reply to some question about me, that I was merely an expense. I believe the phrase was considered very clever. It went the round of society, and eventually was put into a play. And that is why I told you that money is everything, that it is difficult to be truthful, honourable, or respectable if you have no money. A little will do, but you must have a little. If you haven't, you aren't respectable, you're nothing. You become like me, a mere expense. I've borne it for your sake, dearest." "For my sake, father? What do you mean?" "Never mind, best not to ask. My dearest daughter, I would bear it all over again for your sake. But it is maddening work. It goes to the head at last. It makes one feel as if something were giving way there," he said, touching his forehead. "It does indeed." "But father, you mustn't bear this any longer. Not for my sake." "Father, no, not for my sake. You must find some way out of it." "I have found a way out of it. It took me a long while, but I have found the way. There it is," he said, pointing to the typewriting machine. "They don't suspect anything. Not they, the fools. They don't know what is hanging over their heads. I'll tell you, Agnes, but you must not breathe a word of it to anyone. If you did, they would take the machine from me. For they'd like me to remain a mere expense. As long as I'm that, they can do what they like. But as soon as I gain an independence, as soon as I am able to pay for my meals," he whispered, "I mean to put my house in order. But you mustn't breathe a word." "I'll never do anything, father, you ask me not to do. I shall be able to sweep out all those you don't like. There are too many men hanging about here." "Tell me, father, do you like Lord Chadwick?" The Major's face changed expression. "Have I said anything to wound you?" she said, pressing his hand. "No, dear. You asked me if I liked Lord Chadwick. I was thinking. Somehow it seems to me that I rather like him, though I have no reason to do so. He thinks me crazy, but so do others. I know that my conversation bores him, he always tries to get away from me, yet somehow it seems to me that I do like him." "Is he a fast man, father? Is he like Lord Chiselhurst?" "He is much the same as the other men that come here. I don't think he's a bad man, no worse than other men. Is he kind to you, dear? Tell me that. Do you like him?" "Yes, father. He and Mr. St. Clare are the men I like best here." "But why is he here so much, father? He's no relation." "He has dined and lunched here every day for the last 10 years. He's been an expense too. Mother said he is so poor that she has often to lend him money. he should have spent some of the money she lent him on a typewriting machine, and striven as I do to make an independence. When I've got together a little independence, when I can pay for my meals and my clothes, you shall see. None that you dislike shall ever come here, dearest. I'll put my house in order." "But that will take a long time, father. In the meantime—" "What, dear?" "Mother will want me to marry." "They shall not force you to marry. They shall not ask you to do anything you do not like. Lord Chiselhurst ought to be ashamed, a man of his age to want to marry a young girl like you. I will go and tell him so." The Major stood up. He was pale, and Agnes noticed that his lips trembled. "No, father," she said, "do not go to him. I do not know that he wants to marry me. It is only mother's idea, she may be mistaken. You shall not be persecuted by his attentions. Lord Chiselhurst is a gentleman, father, whatever his faults may be. I feel sure when he sees that I do not want him, that he will cease to think of me. Lord Chiselhurst is not the worst." "Who then is the worst? Who is it that you wish me to rid you of?" "I don't wish you to be violent, father, but you might hint to Mr. Moulton that I do not wish that man. He too is merely an expense. I am sure, father, that it is not right of him to put his arms round me. He tried to kiss me. I was alone in the drawing room, and he speaks in a way that I do not like. I don't know, I don't like him, he frightens me." "Frightens you? That fellow, that fellow!" "Yes, he asks me questions. He never shall do so again." "Is he in the drawing room?" "Yes, but father, you cannot speak to him now. There are people in the drawing room." "I don't care who's there." "No, father, no, I beg you. Mother will never forgive me." "Father, you mustn't make a scene." "Father, you cannot go to the drawing room in those clothes." And in desperate resolve Agnes threw herself between the Major and the door, pressing him back with both hands. "They think me a sheep. I have been a sheep too long, but they shall see that even the sheep will turn to save its lamb from the butcher. I'll go to them, yes, and in these clothes. Agnes, let me go." "I want you to speak to Mr. Moulton." "But not now. This is not the time." He tried to push past her, but she resisted him, and sat down in front of his typewriting machine, pale and exhausted, the sweat pearling his bald forehead. She tried to calm him, and to induce him to understand the scandal he would make if he were to go down to the drawing room dressed as he was. But her words did not seem to reach the Major's brain. He only muttered that the time had come to put his house in order. Agnes answered, "Father, for my sake, not now." But he must obey the idea which pierced his brain, and before she could prevent him he slipped past her and opened the door. "Oh, father, don't, for my sake, please." His lips moved, but he did not speak. "I will not make a scene," he said at last. "Father, I will not make a scene, but I must do something. I promise you that I will not make a scene, but I must go down to the drawing room in these clothes." "In these clothes," he repeated. There was something in his look which conveyed a sense of the inevitable, and Agnes watched him descend the stairs. She followed him slowly, catching at the banister, leaning against the wall. She noticed that his step was heavy and irresolute, and hoped he would refrain. But he went on, step after step. End of Agnes Layon's Chapter 4, recording by James Carson. Agnes Layon's Chapter 5 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. He had intended to turn the entire crew out of the house, but Agnes had induced him to relinquish this idea, and as no fresh idea had taken its place, he entered the drawing room with no more than a vague notion that he should parade his old clothes and reprove the conversation. "Olive, I've come down for a cup of tea." "I don't mind giving you a cup," said Mrs. Lahens, "but I think you might have taken the trouble to change your clothes. That's hardly a costume to receive ladies in. Look at him, Lady Castlerich. That's what I've to put up with. Lady Castlerich will excuse my clothes. You know, Lady Castlerich, that I'm very poor. Some years ago I lost my money, and since then I've been merely an expense. It is most humiliating to have to ask your wife for twopence to take the omnibus." "My dear Major," said Harding, "what on earth is the matter with you? You've been working too hard. But, by the way, I forgot to tell you, I've just finished a novel which I shall be glad if you'll copy it for me. You haven't shown me your machine. Come." "I shall be very glad to have your work to do, Harding, but I can't talk to you about it just at present. You must excuse me, I've an explanation to make." "Oh, do not think of going, dear Lady Castlerich. Do not let my costume frighten you away. These are my working clothes. The last money I took from my wife was £16 to buy a typewriting machine. I made 5 shillings last week, 4 shillings went towards paying for the machine. When I'm clear of that debt I shall make enough to pay for my room and my meals. I had always intended then to put my house in order." "But, my dear Major," said Lady Castlerich, trying to get past him, "your house is charmin'. The drawing room is perfectly charmin'. I don't know a more charmin' room." "The room is well enough. It is what one hears in the room." "Hears in the room! Major, I'm sure our conversation has been most agreeable. You'll agree with me that it is a little hard that my daughter should have to sit in her bedroom all day." "But we should be charmed to have her here," expostulated the old lady. "She was here just now." "But she ran away." "Yes, she ran away from the conversation." "Ran away from the conversation, Major. Now, what were we talking about, Olive?" "I don't know. He's in one of his bad humours." "Pay no attention to him, Lady Castlerich," said Mrs. Lahens. "Perhaps you were talking about your lovers, Lady Castlerich," said the Major. "I'm sure I couldn't have been, for the fact is I don't remember." "I really must be going," said Harding. "Good bye, Mrs. Lahens. And now, Major, come with me and we'll talk about the typing of the novel." "Later on, Harding, later on. I've to speak about my daughter. There's so much she doesn't understand. You know, Lady Castlerich, she has been very strictly brought up." "How very strange. I must really be going. Good bye, Major. Charmin' afternoon, I'm sure. I hope," he said, turning to Lilian, "that I can congratulate you on your engagement." "My engagement? With whom? Mr. St. Clare? What makes you think that? We're not engaged. We're merely friends." "It was given out that you were engaged. Mr. Harding said it was physically impossible for you to see more than you did of each other." "My dear Major," said Harding, "you're mistaken. I never said such a thing. I assure you—" "Physically impossible," giggled Lady Castlerich. "That's good. But won't you see me to my carriage, Mr. Harding?" "Did you say physically impossible?" The Major looked round, uncertain whom to address next. Catching Mr. Moulton, who was stealing past him, by the arm, he said, "You too understand how humiliating it is to be a mere expense. Why don't you buy a type–writing machine?" "Perhaps I shall, the first money I get," Mr. Moulton answered, and disengaging his arm he hurried away, leaving the Major alone with his wife. She sat in her arm–chair looking into the fire. The Major waited, expecting her to speak, but she said not a word. "I want to talk to you, Olive." "To hear what I have to say about your conduct, I suppose." "I have nothing to say. I'm not clever like you, and don't say the right thing, but something has to be done, and I did it as best as I could." "You're madder than I thought you were." "Something had to be done?" "Something had to be done. What do you mean?" "But it doesn't matter." "Yes, it does, Olive. I want you to understand that Agnes must be saved." "Saved?" "Yes, saved from this drawing room. You know that it is a pollution for one like her." "I remember," said Mrs. Lahens, turning suddenly, "that you said something about putting your house in order. I didn't understand what you meant. Did you mean this house?" "Yes." "But you forget that this is my house. So you intend to rescue Agnes from this drawing room. You can go." both of you. I'll have both of you put out of doors." "You'll not turn your daughter out of doors. If my drawing room is not good enough for her, let her go back to the convent. You took her from me years ago. You never thought I was good enough for your daughter. There was Chadwick. I begged of you to break with him for the sake of your daughter. You might have done that. I made sacrifices for her. I endured this house. I accepted your lover." "Accepted my lover? You did not expect a woman to be faithful to a man like you. You didn't think that possible, did you?" "What was I to do? What can a man do who is dependent on his wife for his support? Besides, there was more than myself to consider. There was Agnes. Had I divorced you, she would have suffered. Of course, you never thought of yourself, of this house. I dare say you look upon yourself quite as a hero. Well, upon my word," Mrs. Lahens laughed. "I don't think I thought of myself. I dare say the world put the worst construction on my conduct, but you can't say that I took much advantage of the fact that you were willing to let me live in the house. I gave up my room. I live in the meanest room. The kitchen maid complained about it. She left it. There was no use for it. What I eat does not cost you much. I eat very little. Of course I know that that little is too much. Meantime I'm trying to create a little independence. And meantime you shall respect my drawing room. But the mischief is done. You have insulted my friends. You have forced them out of my house. The story will be all over Mayfair to morrow. It will be said that the sheep has turned at last. Nothing is to be gained by keeping you any longer." "But Agnes Agnes will remain with me. You don't propose to take her with you, do you?" "I couldn't support her, at least not yet awhile, not even if Harding gave me the novel he was speaking of to copy." "Support her? Harding give you his novel to copy? You poor fool, you could not spell the words." "True, that is my difficulty. But Agnes cannot remain here without me. That is impossible. To remain here, seeing your friends in this drawing room, things to go on as they are, that child, Olive, you must see that that is impossible. It would be worse than before. If I refuse to have you here any longer, you've no one but yourself to thank. Olive, remember that she is our child. We owe her something. I have suffered a great deal for her sake. You know I have. Do you now suffer something? You'll be better for it. You'll be happier. I am in a way happier for what I have suffered." "You mean if I consent to let you stay here?" "I was not thinking of that. That is not enough." "Not enough? Well, what is enough?" "But I cannot listen," said Mrs. Lahens, speaking half to herself. "I'm keeping him waiting. What a fright I shall be. Our evening will be spoilt." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to dine with Chad, if you wish to know." "You shall not go to Lord Chadwick," said the Major, walking close to his wife. Mrs. Lahens turned from the glass. "You shall not go," repeated the Major. "Go at your peril." They stood looking at each other a moment, with hatred in their eyes. Then with tears in his voice the Major said, "For our daughter's sake give him up. She already suspects, and it makes her so unhappy. She is so good, so innocent. Think of what a shock it would be to her if she were to discover the truth. Give up Chadwick for her sake. You'll never regret. One day or other it will have to end. If you let it end now, you'll repair the past. Her innocence, her goodness. Had I married another man I might have been a virtuous woman. The world asks too much virtue from women. If I had not Chad I should have gone mad long ago. He's been very good to me. Why should I give him up? For why? What has my daughter done for me that I should give up all I have in the world? And what purpose would be served if I did? So that she should preserve her illusions a few months longer. That is all. If she remain in the world she must learn what the world is. If she doesn't want to learn what the world is, the sooner she goes back to the convent the better. And now I must go. I'm late." "You shall not go. You shall see no more of Lord Chadwick. You shall receive no more of your infamous friends. My daughter's mind shall not be polluted." "Don't talk nonsense, Major. Let me go, or I'll have you turned out of the house." "I don't want to, but you'll force me to." "Now let me go." The Major took his wife by the throat and repeated his demand. "Say that this adultery shall cease, or else—" "Or else you'll kill me?" "Father!" Agnes had stolen downstairs. She had waited a few moments on the threshold before she entered the room necessity ordained, and she stood pale and courageous between her parents. Mrs. Lahens sat down on the ottoman, and when the servant arrived with the lamp, Agnes saw that her mother, notwithstanding her paint, was like death. The servant looked under the lamp shade and turned up the wicks. He drew the curtains, and at last the wide mahogany door swept noiselessly over the carpet, and the three were alone. "I'm sorry, Agnes, that you were present just now. Such a scene never happened before, I assure you. A point arose between us, and I'm afraid we both forgot ourselves. It would be better if you went upstairs." "I see," said Mrs. Lahens, "that you understand each other. It is I who had better go." "No, mother, don't go. I would not have you think that, how am I to say it?" Mrs. Lahens looked at her daughter. A strange look it was, of surprise and inquiry. "Mother, I have been but an apple of discord thrown between you. But indeed it was not my fault. Mother dear, it was not my fault." For a moment it seemed as if Mrs. Lahens were going to take her daughter in her arms. But some thought or feeling checked the impulse, and she said: "Talk to your father, Agnes. I cannot stay." "You shall not go," said the Major, laying his hand on her arm. "You shall not go to Lord Chadwick." Oh, father, I beg of you. It is with gentleness and love that we overcome our troubles. Let mother go if she wants to go." The Major took his hand from his wife's arm, and Mrs. Lahens said: "You're a good girl, Agnes. I wish you had always remained with me. If your father had not taken you from me, I might—" She left the room hurriedly, and a few moments after they heard her drive away in a cab. "Father, I know everything." "You overheard?" "Yes, father. As your voices grew more angry I crept downstairs. I heard about Lord Chadwick. You must have patience. You must be gentle." "Agnes, I have been patient. I have been gentle. That was my mistake." "Perhaps, father, it would have been better if you had acted differently at first, a long time ago. But I'm sure that the present is no time for anger. I know that it was on my account, that it was to save me, that you know what I mean." "You're right, Agnes. My mistake began long ago. But you must not judge me harshly. You do not know, you cannot realize what my position has been in this house. I could do nothing. When a man has lost his money—" "I do not judge you, father, nor mother either. It is not for me to judge. I am ignorant of the world, and wish to remain ignorant of it. I always felt that it would be best so. Now I am sure of it. Agnes, it is too soon for you to judge. This house, she's gone to meet that man. But she shall not, I swear it. That man, I'll take him by the throat. I ought to have done so long ago, but it is not too late. Father, let us say a prayer together. I have not said one with you since I was a little child. Will you kneel down with me and say a prayer for mother?" She stretched out her hand to him, and they knelt down together in the drawing room. Agnes said: "O my God, we offer up an Our Father and Hail Mary, that thou mayest give us all grace to overcome temptation." The Major repeated the prayers after his daughter, and when they rose from their knees, Agnes said: "Father, I never asked a favour of you before. You will not refuse me this?" The Major looked at his daughter tenderly. You will never again be violent. You promise me this, father. I shall be miserable if you don't. You promise me this, father. You cannot refuse me. It is my first request and my last." The Major's face was full of tears. There was none on Agnes's face, but her eyes shone with anticipation and desire. "Promise," she said, "promise." "I promise." "And when the temptation comes, you'll remember your promise to me?" "Yes, Agnes, I'll remember." The strain that the extortion of the promise had put upon her feelings had exhausted the girl. She then pressed her hands to her eyes and dropped on the ottoman. For a long while father and daughter sat opposite each other without speaking. At last the Major said, "I must go out, I cannot stop here. But, father, remember, you are not going to mother." "No, only for a trot around the square." She pressed her hand to her forehead. She felt her eyes, they were dry and burning. And it was not until the servant announced Father White that her tears flowed. End of Agnes Layon's Chapter 5, recording by James Carson. Agnes Layon's Chapter 6 of Celibates by George Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by James Carson. "Then you've heard," said Agnes, coming forward and taking the priest's hand. "How did you hear? Did you meet father?" "No, my dear child, I've heard nothing. I did not meet your father. I was in London to-day for the first time since I last saw you. I ought to have called earlier, but I was detained. I'm afraid I'm late. It must be getting late. It must be getting near your dinner hour. I see that you know nothing, and that I shall have to tell you all." "Yes, my dear child, tell me everything." Agnes sat on the ottoman. Father White took a chair near her. "Tell me everything. I see you've been weeping. You're not happy at home, then." "Oh, father, happy! If you only knew, if you only knew. I cannot tell you." Then, seeing in the priest's arrival a means of escape from the danger of her position between her father and mother, she cried, "You must take me back to the convent to-night. I cannot meet mother when she comes home. Something dreadful might happen. Father White, you must take me back to the convent. Say that you will, say that you will." "My dear child, you are agitated. Calm yourself. What has happened? Tell me." "It is too long a story. It is too dreadful. I cannot tell it all to you now. Later I'll tell you. Take me back to the convent. I cannot meet mother. I cannot." "But what has your mother done? Has she been cruel to you? Has she struck you?" "Struck me? If that were all, that would be nothing." The priest's face turned a trifle paler. He felt that something dreadful had happened. The girl was overcome, her nerves had given way, and she could hardly speak. It was not well to insist that she should be put to the torture of a complete narrative. "Where is your father?" he said. "Major Lahens will tell me. He knows, I suppose, all about it. Calm yourself, Agnes. Tell me where your father is. That will be sufficient." "Father is walking round the square." "But don't leave me, don't. I cannot remain in this room alone," she said, looking round with a frightened air. "I'll wait till he comes in." "He may not come in for hours. Perhaps he'll never come back. Anything may happen." "If he's walking round the square he can be sent for." "No, Father White, I'll be calm. I'll tell you. I must tell you. But you'll not desert me. You'll not leave me here to meet mother." "Don't you think, my dear child, that it would be better that I should see your father, that he should tell me?" "No, I'd sooner tell you myself. Father could not explain. To-morrow or after in the convent I'll tell you. I'll tell you and Mother Abbess." "You must see, Agnes, that I cannot take you away from your father's house without his permission." "It is not father's house." "Well, your mother's house." "That is quite different. I see that I must tell you." "Of course I must." "Surely, Agnes, it would be better to postpone telling me till to-morrow. You're tired, you've been crying, you'll be able to tell me better in the morning. I'll call here early to-morrow morning." "No, you must take me back to the convent to-night. I cannot remain here. You'll agree with me that I cannot when I tell you all." Agnes looked at Father White. She was no longer crying. She had regained her self-possession in the necessity of the moment, and she began with hardly a tremble in her voice. "Mother is not... I'm afraid she is not. But how am I to accuse my own mother? I'm sure now, my dear child, that I was right when I suggested that I should speak to Major Lahens, because you don't know the circumstances, nor do you know my father. No, it must be I must tell you." There was a note of conviction in Agnes's voice which silenced further protestation, and Father White listened. "You see, this house and everything here belongs to mother. It is she who pays for everything. Father lost all his money some years ago. He was cheated out of it in the city. The loss of his money preyed upon his mind. He could not stand the humiliation of asking his wife, as he puts it, for twopence to take the omnibus. Mother did not care for father. She cared for someone else, and that of course made father's dependence still more humiliating. It preyed on his mind, and he lives in the house like a servant, in a little room under the roof that the kitchen maid would not sleep in. He has a typewriting machine up there, and he makes a few shillings a week by copying. He bought the butler's old overcoat. It is very sad to see him up there at work, and to hear him talk. I must tell you that the people who come here are not good people. I don't think that they can be very nice. The conversation in this drawing-room, I'm sure, is not. There is a man who comes here whom I don't like at all, a Mr. Moulton. He says things that are not nice, and he tried to kiss me the other day. I was afraid of him, and mother used to leave me alone with him. I had difficulty in getting away from him, so I asked father to speak. I thought that father, when he met him alone, would tell him not to talk as he did, but father got so angry that, notwithstanding all I could do to prevent him, he went down in his old clothes to the drawing-room and, I suppose, insulted everyone. Anyhow, they all went away. I felt that something was happening, so I listened on the stairs. Father and mother were talking violently, and when he grasped mother's throat, I rushed between them. That is the whole story. A terrible story. So you see that it is impossible for me to remain here. I cannot meet mother after what has happened. You must take me to the convent tonight. Say that you will, Father White." "Have you not thought, my child, that it may be your duty to remain here as mediator, as peacemaker? Father has promised me that he will never raise his hand to mother again. I made him understand that it was by gentleness and patience she must be won back. All the more reason that you should remain here to watch and encourage the good work you have begun. But, Father White, I feel that I have done all that I can do. My prayers must do the rest. But your presence in this house would be an influence for good, and would check again, as it did to-day, these unhappy outbursts of violence. Father has promised me never to resort to violence again. My presence is the temptation to do so. Things might happen, things would be sure to happen, that would force him to forget his promise. He might kill mother. That is the way these things end. He has borne with a great deal. He has said nothing. People think that he feels nothing. He may think so himself, but something is all the while growing within him, and the day comes when he will stand it no longer, when he will kill mother. Very little suffices. I very nearly sufficed. I must go, Father. You must take me away." Agnes spoke out of the fullness of her instinct, and Father White wondered, for such knowledge of life seemed very strange in one of Agnes's age and ignorance. "I understand, my child. As you say, it is difficult for you to remain here, but I cannot take you away without consulting your father. Father will not oppose my returning to the convent. I have spoken to him. He knows how unhappy I am. But I cannot take you away without his authority. I did not intend to leave without bidding father good-bye. We can stop the cab as we go round the square." "But your clothes are not packed." "They will lend me all I want at the convent. My clothes can be sent after me. Father, you must take me away. I cannot remain here and meet my mother after what happened. My mission here is ended. Prayer will do the rest. I want to go to the convent so that I shall be free to pray for mother." Unable to resist the intensity of the girl's will, Father White answered that he would wait for her while she went upstairs to get her hat and jacket. As he paced the room he tried to think, but he could not catch a single thread of thought. He was merely aware of the horrible position that this dear, good and innocent girl had so unexpectedly found herself thrust into, and of the good sense and resource she had displayed in her time of trial. "No doubt she is right," he thought. "She cannot remain here. She must go back to the convent, at least for the present. But once she goes back she will never again be persuaded to leave it. So much the better. Another soul for God and joy everlasting." The door opened. Agnes wore the same dress as she had arrived in, the same little black fur jacket, and her hands were in the same little muff. They went downstairs without speaking, and Father White called a four-wheeled cab. As they got in, he said, "You know that I cannot possibly take you away without first obtaining your father's authority. We shall meet him as we go round the square. Tell the cabman to drive slowly. I'll watch this side, you keep watch that side. We can't miss him." "I'm to drive round the square till you see a gentleman walking?" "Yes, and then we'll stop you," said Father White. Suddenly Agnes cried, "There is father, there!" Father White poked his umbrella through the window, and Agnes screamed, and she had to scream her loudest, so absorbed was the Major. "Father White called to see me. I've asked him to take me back to the convent. You'll let me go, Father? I shall be happier there than at home." The Major did not answer, and the priest said, "If you'll allow me, Major Lahens, I'd like to have a few minutes' conversation with you." He got out of the cab, and Agnes waited anxiously. She could hear them talking, and she prayed that she might sleep at the convent that night. At last the Major came to the cab door and said, "If you wish, Agnes, to go back to the convent with Father White, you can. I'll work hard and make some money, and then you'll come and live with me." "Yes, Father. Remember you'll always be in my thoughts. It is good of you to let me go. Indeed it is. You must try not to miss me too much, and you'll often come and see me." "Yes, dear." "And, Father dear, you'll remember your promise?" "Yes, dear. Good-bye." She kissed her father on the forehead and burst into tears. The cab jangled on. The priest did not speak, and gradually through the girl's grief there grew remembrance of the road leading to the convent, and though they were still 5 miles away or more, she saw the gate at the corner of the lane, the porteress too. She saw the quiet, sedate nuns hastening down the narrow passages towards their chapel. She saw them playing with their doves like innocent children. She saw them chase the ball down the gravel walks and across the swards. She saw her life from end to end, from the moment when the porteress would open the door to the time when she would be laid in the little cemetery at the end of the garden where the nuns go to rest. The end. End of Agnes Lahens, Chapter 6. Recording by James Carson. End of Celibates by George Moore.